Hey there, welcome to Broderos. Tonight, we've got hours of chilling horror stories combined with soothing rain sounds to help you relax and sleep. Before you drift off, leave a comment below and let us know where you're listening from and what time it is. And don't forget to hit that like button and subscribe right away. If you end up not enjoying it, you can always take it back later. Get cozy and let the fear take over. When I first moved to the new neighborhood, everything seemed normal. The houses were neat and the streets were quiet. I didn't know anyone yet, but it felt like a fresh start, peaceful and calm. It wasn't until the first night that I began to notice something strange. I had just finished unpacking and settled down in my new room. It was a cozy space, with a window that looked out onto the street. The kind of view that was quiet and still, just like the rest of the neighborhood. It was late, nearly midnight, and I was drifting off to sleep when I heard the first sound. A faint noise, almost like a rustle. I sat up in bed, confused, listening closely. It came from across the street, from the abandoned house that had been empty for as long as I could remember. I could tell it wasn't the wind. It sounded deliberate, as if something, or someone, was moving inside. I hesitated for a moment, thinking it might just be my imagination. But then it happened again. A soft, dragging sound, almost like footsteps on the floorboards. I felt a chill crawl up my spine. I told myself it was nothing, maybe an animal, maybe just the house settling, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. I glanced at the window, the one that faced the empty house, and I thought I saw something, just a flicker of movement in one of the windows. But when I looked again, there was nothing. I pulled the blanket tightly around me, trying to convince myself that it was all in my head. But the sounds continued, soft and persistent. First, the dragging, then a faint tapping noise. Like someone was knocking on the walls, but too softly for anyone to hear from the outside. I wanted to ignore it, to forget about it and sleep, but something kept me awake, kept my eyes on the window. I couldn't stop myself from looking over and over again, hoping to see nothing. Hoping the movement in the window was just a trick of the light. But every time I looked, I swore I saw a shadow, just a blur, nothing concrete, but enough to make my heart race. After what felt like hours, the sounds finally stopped. The silence that followed was almost worse than the noise itself. It was as if the air had grown thicker, heavier. I couldn't sleep. My mind kept racing, trying to figure out what had caused the noises. I had to know. But the thought of going over there, of stepping into that dark, abandoned house, filled me with a sense of dread. Still, something inside me urged me to find out, to solve the mystery. I forced myself to close my eyes and drift into a restless sleep, but the images from the window, the sounds echoing in my mind, would not fade. It felt like the house was watching me. And for the first time in my life, I realized I might not be as alone as I thought. The next morning, I tried to shake off the feeling from the night before. It was just my mind playing tricks on me, I told myself. Maybe the house had rats, or it was just an old building making strange noises. After all, houses do that sometimes. They creak and groan as they settle, right? But as I walked to the kitchen, the empty house across the street seemed to call out to me. Its windows stared back, dark and vacant, as though it were waiting for something or someone. My eyes kept drifting to it, drawn to the dark silhouette of the house against the bright morning sky. I tried to focus on the day ahead, but my thoughts kept returning to it. I couldn't help but wonder who had lived there before. Why had they left? And why did the house seem so strange? That afternoon, I found myself standing on the sidewalk in front of the house, staring up at its withered facade. It looked even older up close, the paint peeling from the walls, the windows clouded with dirt. The front door was slightly ajar, creaking in the breeze. I thought about the sounds I had heard last night, about the shadow I thought I had seen. The curiosity gnawed at me, making it hard to ignore. I took a step closer, my heart racing in my chest. A voice in my head screamed at me to turn back, but another voice, quieter and more insistent, urged me to go inside. The door creaked louder as I pushed it open. The air inside was thick with dust, the smell of old wood and mildew filling my nostrils. It was cold. Too cold. I stepped inside cautiously, my footsteps echoing in the empty space. The floorboards groaned beneath me as I moved further into the house. The silence was suffocating. I felt as though the house was holding its breath, waiting for me to make the next move. Then I heard it again. A faint rustling sound, like something shifting in the dark. My heart skipped a beat, and I froze in place. I glanced around, but the house seemed still, too still. I crept forward, slowly, and stopped in front of a staircase that led up to the second floor. The rustling sound came from above. I felt my breath catch in my throat. There was definitely someone up there. I almost turned to leave, but something kept me rooted to the spot. I had to know. I had to see for myself what was in that house. Taking a deep breath, I began to climb the stairs. Each step creaked louder than the last, as if the house itself was protesting my presence. The air grew colder with each step, the silence pressing in on me. When I reached the top, I stood in the hallway, listening. The rustling was now replaced by a soft tapping sound. I couldn't tell where it was coming from, but it was close. Very close. I took another step forward, my heart pounding in my chest. Then I saw it, a shadow, just at the edge of my vision, flickering in the dim light. I spun around, but there was nothing there. Only the cold, empty hallway. The tapping continued, louder now, and I realized it was coming from the room at the end of the hall. My instinct screamed at me to turn around, to run, but I couldn't. My feet moved on their own, carrying me toward the door. As I reached for the doorknob, I heard a voice. Low, quiet, almost a whisper, but clear enough to make my blood run cold. Don't go in. I froze. The voice was unmistakable, and it sounded human. But there was no one there. The door creaked open, and I stepped inside. The room was dark, with only a faint sliver of light seeping through the dusty curtains. I felt a wave of cold wash over me as I stepped inside. The air was thick, heavy, like it had been untouched for years. My eyes adjusted to the darkness, and I could make out the shape of old furniture covered in white sheets. A rocking chair sat by the window, unmoving, as if waiting for someone to sit in it. The tapping had stopped. Everything was still again. But that silence, it wasn't peaceful. It felt oppressive, as if the room itself was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. I scanned the room, but there was no sign of anyone. No figure, no movement. Yet, something was there. I could feel it, like a presence just beyond the edge of my perception. As I took another step forward, I noticed something on the floor. A small, dark stain near the corner. I bent down to look, my fingers brushing against the cold wood of the floor. The stain was too irregular to be something harmless, like spilled ink. It looked almost like blood. I recoiled, my pulse quickening. What was this place? What had happened here? The silence was broken by a sudden creak from behind me. I whipped around, my heart in my throat, but the room was empty. I was alone. Still, the feeling of being watched didn't leave. It only intensified, as if invisible eyes were following my every move. The walls seemed to press in around me, and I felt the temperature drop even further, as if the house itself was feeding on my fear. I had to get out. But as I turned toward the door, I heard the softest sound, like a whisper, coming from the rocking chair. It was a slow, rhythmic creak, as if someone was sitting in it. I turned to look. The chair was rocking back and forth on its own. Slowly, methodically, but there was no one there. I felt a chill run down my spine, my breath catching in my throat. My mind screamed at me to leave, to run, but my body wouldn't move. I stood frozen, watching the chair move, unable to tear my eyes away. Then, as if in response to my fear, the air grew even colder. A soft, raspy voice echoed through the room, barely audible, but unmistakable. "Leave this place." I snapped my head around, trying to find the source of the voice, but the room was still empty. The shadows in the corners seemed to shift, but there was no one there. My hands were trembling, my heart pounding in my chest. The voice came again, louder this time, a whisper so close to my ear that I could feel the cold breath on my skin. "Get out." I stumbled back, my legs weak beneath me. I turned and bolted for the door, my breath coming in sharp gasps. The moment I touched the doorknob, a loud bang sounded from behind me, making me jump. It was the sound of something heavy hitting the floor. I spun around, but there was nothing, only the same empty room. I tore the door open and ran down the hallway, my footsteps echoing in the silence. The house felt alive now, as if it were reaching out to grab me. The darkness seemed to stretch toward me, pulling me back into the depths of the house. I didn't stop running until I was outside, the door slamming shut behind me with a force that shook the entire house. I collapsed onto the front steps, gasping for breath, my mind spinning. I had been inside for only a few minutes, but it felt like hours. My body was trembling, my heart still racing. But the worst part? I wasn't alone. I could still feel the presence, the eyes on me, even from outside the house. It was as if the house itself was watching me now, waiting. And I knew that I would be back. The days after that encounter were a blur. I couldn't focus on anything. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the rocking chair swaying in that dark room. Every creak of wood in my own house sent a jolt of panic through me. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was following me, something watching from just beyond my vision. I told myself it was just my nerves. I had been alone too much, overthinking everything. The house had been abandoned for years, and houses like that always felt unsettling. Old houses creaked, groaned, and made noises. There was nothing sinister about it. But the doubt lingered. The whispers. The cold. The eyes that seemed to follow me. I couldn't ignore it anymore. And that's when I knew, despite all the warnings in my head, I had to go back. I didn't want to. I really didn't. But there was a pull, a compulsion I couldn't explain. It felt like something was calling to me, urging me to return. And so, on the 5th night after the incident, I found myself standing in front of the house again. The street was empty, as it always was at this time of night. The world around me was silent. But my heart was pounding in my chest, louder than any sound I had ever heard. I had to fight the urge to turn around and walk away. but I didn't. I couldn't. I stepped up to the front door. It was closed now, as if it had never been opened before. No creak. No whisper. Just the solid, uninviting door staring back at me. I reached for the doorknob, feeling the cold metal under my fingers. It didn't move. I twisted it again, harder, but it was stuck. A part of me wanted to leave, to forget this madness. But something inside urged me forward. I stepped back, and without thinking, I pushed against the door with my shoulder. It groaned and creaked, but this time it opened. I didn't hesitate. I walked inside. The air was thick with dust again, the silence overwhelming. I couldn't shake the feeling that something had changed. The house felt even colder than before, the shadows deeper, more oppressive. I swallowed hard, my pulse racing in my throat. I forced myself to take a step, then another, making my way toward the stairs. I felt drawn upstairs, even though every fiber of my being screamed at me to leave. I couldn't stop. I had to see it. I had to know what was happening. The house groaned beneath me as I ascended the staircase. The air around me felt heavier, as if something was pressing in from all sides. The cold was almost unbearable now, the temperature dropping with every step I took. When I reached the top, I turned left, toward the room where it had all happened. The door was ajar, just as it had been before. The same faint, unsettling light filtered in through the curtains. I stepped inside, and the room seemed to inhale, as if it were alive. The rocking chair sat in the corner, but it was still. There was no movement. No creaking. For a moment, I thought I had imagined everything. Maybe it had all been some twisted dream. Then I heard it, the sound of slow, deliberate footsteps behind me. I spun around, my heart in my throat, but there was no one there. Just the empty room. The footsteps grew louder, closer, as if something, or someone, was circling me. The cold was unbearable now, and I felt an overwhelming presence behind me. My breath hitched in my chest, and I knew I wasn't alone. I turned quickly, my eyes darting to the shadows in the corners of the room. I saw it then. A figure, just standing there, watching me. It was human, at least, it looked human. But there was something wrong about it. It was distorted, its shape flickering in and out of focus, like a reflection in a cracked mirror. Its eyes were dark and hollow, staring at me with an intensity that chilled me to the bone. I wanted to scream, but no sound came. My body wouldn't move. My legs felt like lead, my chest tight with terror. The figure took a step forward, and the room seemed to contract, the walls closing in around me. I could feel the presence press against me, suffocating me. Leave, the voice came again, the whisper clear and urgent, but now it was different, distorted, like it was coming from within my own head. The figure stepped closer. I could see the outline of its face now, pale, twisted, with deep-set eyes that burned into my soul. "Get out," it repeated, the voice growing stronger. I didn't need any more encouragement. My body moved of its own accord, my legs carrying me toward the door. I slammed it open and ran down the stairs, not daring to look back. The house seemed to shake as I bolted through the front door, the sound of footsteps following me, getting louder, as if something was chasing me. I didn't stop until I was back in my own house, locked away in my room, heart racing, body trembling. The silence in my home felt almost like a relief, but it didn't last. I knew I couldn't escape it. It wasn't just in that house. It was inside me now. The next few days passed in a haze, each one blending into the other. I couldn't focus on anything. I couldn't eat. I barely slept. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the figure, the hollow eyes, the distorted face, the voice that still echoed in my mind. The presence that had followed me out of the house had never left. The air in my own home felt colder now. The walls seemed to close in around me, and I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching me from the dark corners of my room. At night, I would hear soft creaks, footsteps, faint but distinct, moving around the house. I would sit up in bed, listening, waiting for the sound to stop. But it never did. And then, the dream started. I would be back in that room, standing in front of the rocking chair, watching it move on its own. The figure would be there, too, standing in the shadows, its eyes boring into mine. But now it was closer. It would whisper to me, its voice low and insistent, as if trying to pull me into the darkness with it. "Come with me," it would say. "You belong here." I woke up every morning drenched in sweat, my heart pounding. The fear had become a constant companion. I couldn't escape it. One night, the whispers reached a new level. I woke to find my room freezing cold, the temperature so low that I could see my breath in the air. The sounds were louder now, footsteps, dragging along the floor, echoing through the silence. They were coming closer, and I knew without a doubt that they were real this time. I didn't have the strength to ignore it anymore. I knew what I had to do. I had to go back. I didn't want to. Every part of me screamed to stay away, to run and never look back. But I knew it wasn't over. The house had claimed me, and no matter how far I ran, it wouldn't let me go. I gathered what little courage I had left and walked out into the night, the streets empty and silent around me. My heart was heavy with dread, but I didn't stop. I couldn't. When I reached the house, the door was open again, just like before. I didn't hesitate this time. I stepped inside, the cold air rushing to meet me. The house was darker now, the shadows deeper, the silence suffocating. I walked through the halls, the creaks of the floorboards beneath me the only sound. The whispers had begun again, faint at first, but growing louder with every step I took. I reached the stairs and began to climb, each step feeling like a weight on my chest. As I reached the top, the cold intensified. It felt like the air itself was alive, wrapping around me, pulling me deeper into the house. I reached the door to the room. It was already open, and the chair was there, swaying gently in the dim light. But this time, there was no hesitation. I knew what was waiting for me. I stepped inside. The figure was there, just as it had been before. But now, it was different. Its shape flickered, distorting, becoming clearer and more solid, as if it was ready to take form. Its eyes locked onto mine, hollow and dark, and I felt my body freeze in place. "You've come back," it whispered, the voice echoing through my mind. "You belong to me now." I could feel the room closing in around me, the walls pressing against me, suffocating me. I tried to move, to run, but my body wouldn't respond. It was as if the house itself had taken hold of me, anchoring me in place. The figure stepped forward, its shape becoming clearer, its face twisted in a grotesque mockery of a human expression. It reached out a hand, and I could feel its cold touch even before it made contact with my skin. "No," I whispered, but my voice was drowned out by the sound of the house groaning, the walls vibrating with a deep, resonant hum. "It's too late," the figure said. "You've already crossed the line." And with that, I felt myself being pulled into the darkness, as if the house itself was swallowing me whole. The last thing I saw before everything went black was the figure's eyes, wide and empty, staring into mine. When I woke, I wasn't in the room anymore. The house was silent, eerily still. The cold was gone, but I could still feel the presence lingering around me, just beyond my reach. I was trapped. I had never left. The house had claimed me, and I would never escape. It started with a question. Have you ever looked at something so ordinary, and then, for just a moment, felt like it was hiding something? I had never thought much about puddles. They were just small, fleeting remnants of rain, disappearing as quickly as they arrived. But that day, after the storm had passed and the sun began to peek through the clouds, something about the puddle in front of me caught my attention. It was just a puddle, no different from any other. I had been walking home, the wet pavement reflecting the sky and trees around me. But as I neared it, I stopped. For some reason, my gaze was drawn to it. The surface of the water was disturbed by a slight breeze, yet the reflection seemed too clear, too sharp for something so simple. I crouched down, squinting at the mirror-like surface. At first, all I could see was my own face, tired, rain-soaked, the kind of face someone would wear after a long day. But as I stared, something shifted. The face in the puddle wasn't mine anymore. The reflection was different. It was an older face, thinner, with hollow eyes. Its expression was still, but there was something unsettling about it, like it was waiting, watching. I felt a shiver run down my spine. I blinked, thinking maybe it was just a trick of the light. But when I looked again, the face remained. I leaned in closer, almost instinctively. The face in the puddle seemed to adjust with me, becoming sharper, clearer, as though it could sense my curiosity. I could feel my heart begin to race. There was something wrong, but I couldn't look away. The reflection seemed almost alive, as if it were waiting for something. Then, just as I was about to pull away, I noticed it. The face in the puddle, it moved. At first, it was subtle. The eyes shifted, as if the figure in the puddle was following my movements. Then, the lips twitched, just barely. I didn't know what I was seeing. It couldn't be real. It was just a reflection. It had to be. But my pulse quickened as I leaned even closer. The face was no longer just a reflection. It was aware of me. And it was waiting. I jerked back, standing up quickly, but my legs felt shaky, as if they were betraying me. The puddle remained, but now it seemed darker, deeper. The rain had stopped, but I could feel the cold moisture on my skin. I turned away, my feet carrying me forward without any clear destination. The feeling of being watched lingered, though. It didn't fade. The image of that face, those hollow eyes, stuck with me as if it had been branded into my mind. For the rest of the walk, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. I kept looking over my shoulder, expecting to see the reflection following me, though I knew I was being irrational. The streets were quiet. The sun had come out. It was a peaceful, ordinary afternoon. But as I reached my door, I couldn't escape the thought that maybe the puddle wasn't just a reflection. Maybe it was something else entirely. The next morning, I couldn't stop thinking about it. The puddle, the face, the way it had moved. It all felt like a bad dream, something my mind had twisted into a terrible image, but I knew deep down that it wasn't. It had been real. and it kept creeping into my thoughts at the most unexpected moments. I tried to shake it off. I told myself it was nothing more than a trick of the light, a weird quirk of my brain playing games with me. But something inside me couldn't let go. It gnawed at me. And the worst part? The fear wasn't even about the face itself. It was about what I had felt while I leaned in closer. That strange sense of connection, like I wasn't just looking at a reflection, but at something or someone who knew me. I went about my day as usual, trying to keep myself distracted. Work was a blur, the noise of the office just a dull hum in the background. I kept thinking about that face, about how it had watched me, moved with me. But the moment I had gotten home, I had decided to forget it. To move on. That evening, after the sun had dipped behind the horizon, the rain started up again, soft and steady. I sat in my room, staring out the window, the dull sound of the rain tapping against the glass. I could see the streetlights flickering, casting long shadows across the wet pavement. A part of me knew it was irrational, but I couldn't help myself. I had to go back. I had to see if the puddle was still there. I couldn't explain why. Maybe I was just curious, or maybe I wanted to prove to myself that it had all been a figment of my imagination. But deep down, I knew there was something more. Something I couldn't understand. I grabbed my coat and stepped outside, the chill of the evening air biting at my skin. The streets were quiet, the kind of eerie silence that only rain could bring. The sound of my footsteps echoed in the empty road, and with each step, the unease in my chest grew heavier. When I reached the spot where the puddle had been, I stopped. I didn't see it at first. The ground was slick and wet, but there was no puddle. No reflection. I let out a breath I didn't realize I had been holding, a small relief spreading through me. Maybe it had been nothing after all. Maybe I had imagined it, or maybe the rain had washed it away. But then, just as I was about to turn around and leave, I saw it. The puddle. It had appeared again, right in the same spot. But this time, something was different. It was bigger, darker. The water was still, but it seemed deeper, as though it held more than just a reflection. I approached slowly, my heart thudding in my chest. There, in the center of the puddle, was the face again. The same face I had seen yesterday. But now, it was clearer, more distinct, and it was moving. I couldn't believe my eyes. The face, it was smiling. Not a normal smile, but something twisted, like it was mocking me. The eyes blinked, slowly, and I could feel them staring at me, following my every movement. I stepped back, my body shaking, but my gaze was locked on the puddle. It wasn't just a reflection anymore. It was alive, reacting to me. The lips moved, as though forming words, but the sound was muffled, like a whisper trapped underwater. "Come closer," it seemed to say. The voice was soft, but clear, and it sent a chill crawling down my spine. I couldn't move. I couldn't look away. The face was too real, too familiar. It wasn't mine, but it felt like it belonged to me in some way. I took a step back, then another, my feet feeling like they were glued to the ground. But no matter how far I moved, the face remained in the puddle, watching me, waiting for me to come closer. And then, it did something even worse. It lifted its hand from the surface of the water, the fingers moving in slow, deliberate motions. The reflection was no longer confined to the puddle. It was reaching out, as if it were about to grab me. I stumbled back, my heart racing. The face didn't just want to watch anymore. It wanted to touch me. It wanted to. Before I could process it, the ground beneath me seemed to shift. The puddle rippled violently, the face distorting as if it were being pulled deeper into the water. I couldn't look away, even as my legs screamed for me to run. And then, a voice, much louder now, tore through the air. "You can't escape." I turned and ran, my breath coming in short, panicked gasps. I didn't dare look back, the sound of the voice echoing in my mind, growing louder with every step. But as I rounded the corner and the puddle disappeared from view, I couldn't shake the feeling that it was still there, waiting, watching. And somewhere, deep inside, I knew that I hadn't just encountered something in that puddle. I had invited it into my life. The next few days felt like a blur. I couldn't focus on anything. My mind kept drifting back to the puddle, to that face, to the voice that had shaken me to my core. I couldn't escape it. Everywhere I went, I felt its presence hovering over me, like it was waiting for the right moment to strike again. I tried to go about my daily routine. I worked, I ate, I slept, but I was always looking over my shoulder. Every reflective surface I passed, every glimmer of water, made my heart race. I couldn't stop thinking about the voice, about the words it had spoken to me. "You can't escape." I told myself I was being paranoid, that it was just the stress and fear playing tricks on my mind. But every night, I found myself unable to sleep, my thoughts spiraling back to the puddle. I couldn't get rid of it. And I knew that it was just a matter of time before I would be drawn back to it, like some invisible force pulling me toward it. One evening, as I sat in my room, trying to block out the unease crawling through my body, I heard something. A faint sound at first, like a whisper from far away. It was so soft that I almost thought I imagined it. But then it came again, louder this time, like a voice, low and distorted, but clear enough for me to understand. "Come closer." I froze. My heart began to race, and I turned my head toward the window. The night outside was dark, the rain still falling in heavy sheets. But through the street glass, I could see the reflection of the streetlights glistening on the wet pavement. And there, in the distance, I saw it. The puddle. It was back. My breath caught in my throat. I hadn't even noticed that it had appeared again, just like before. And this time, the voice was louder. I couldn't ignore it. It was calling to me, beckoning me like an old friend or a dangerous enemy. I couldn't stop myself. I didn't want to go, didn't want to be near that thing, that face, but my body was moving before I could think. I grabbed my coat and stepped out into the night, my feet moving automatically, like I was being controlled by something else. The rain was heavier now, the air thick with moisture. The streets were eerily quiet, as though the world was holding its breath. I walked, step after step, toward the spot where the puddle had been before. The voice in my head, growing louder with each passing moment. "Come closer. You can't hide from me." I reached the place where the puddle had been. But now, there was nothing. The ground was just wet asphalt, gleaming in the dim light, with no sign of the reflection. I stood there, confused, a sense of relief mixing with disappointment. Had it all been a trick? Had I imagined it all? But then, out of the corner of my eye, I saw it again. The puddle, growing larger in the reflection of the streetlight. And this time, there was no mistake. The face was there, staring up at me. It was different this time. The face wasn't just still, it was moving, shifting, twisting in ways that weren't possible. The features worked and changed, like the face of someone trying to escape from the water, trying to reach out. I saw the mouth opening and closing as if trying to speak, but the words were muffled and distorted just beyond my comprehension. And then it happened again. The voice, now clear and unmistakable, surged through the air, reverberating in my bones. "You can't run from me." I backed away, my legs trembling beneath me, but my feet refused to carry me away. The puddles seemed to pull at me, the face drawing me closer, as if it were calling me by name. I could hear my pulse pounding in my ears, feel the cold sweat gathering on the back of my neck. "Come closer," it whispered, the voice soft and insistent, wrapping around me like a thread. "I'm waiting for you." The words sank deep into my chest, wrapping themselves around my heart, tightening. The voice felt so real, so alive, like it was speaking directly to me. Like it knew me. And I couldn't look away. I felt like I was sinking into the puddle, my feet rooted to the ground. My vision blurred, my body heavy and stiff as if the puddle was pulling me in, threatening to swallow me whole. I closed my eyes, trying to fight it, trying to block it out, but the voice continued to call to me, growing louder, closer, until it felt like it was right next to me. "You can't escape." I snapped my eyes open. The face was there, right in front of me, so close that I could feel the chill of the water seeping into my skin, like it was rising from the ground, climbing up my legs. I screamed, but the sound was swallowed by the rain and the cold. Then, without warning, the puddle surged up, and the face was gone. I stumbled back, gasping for air, the night suddenly feeling suffocating. The voice had stopped, but the feeling of it, the weight of its presence, lingered in the air like a curse. I had to get away. I couldn't stay there another second. I turned and ran, my heart pounding in my chest, my legs aching with every step. I didn't stop until I was back inside my house, the door slamming shut behind me. I locked the door, but even then, I didn't feel safe. I could feel the echo of that voice in my mind, in my bones, and I knew it wasn't over. The puddle, the face, the voice, they were still there, waiting, watching. And it was only a matter of time before they would come for me again. I couldn't escape it anymore. The puddle, the voice, the face, everything that had been haunting me for days was now a part of my life, a presence that I couldn't outrun. I locked myself in my room, avoiding mirrors, avoiding rain-soaked streets. But even in the safety of my home, I could feel it waiting. The days passed, but I couldn't escape the constant feeling of being watched. My every move seemed to echo through the silence. I couldn't concentrate. At work, I stared at my computer screen but saw nothing. I heard nothing. My thoughts were consumed by the memory of that face, the way it twisted and moved, and the voice that seemed to speak to me directly. It wasn't just paranoia. The things that had started as strange, unsettling events were now undeniable. I wasn't imagining it. The puddle was real. The face was real. And the voice? It was only getting louder. I stopped going outside. I couldn't. Every time I stepped out, I would find myself drawn to the spot where it had all started. And every time, I could feel that same cold pull, the voice whispering to me, beckoning me closer. It was like a thread pulling me, and I was powerless to resist. I stopped sleeping. Or at least, it felt that way. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the face. The eyes, hollow and endless, staring into mine, waiting. The mouth, twisted in that sickening smile, moving silently. It never left me. I could hear it even when I wasn't near the puddle. It spoke to me in my dreams, in my thoughts. It knew me. I had to do something. I had to make it stop. But I couldn't figure out how. I searched online, reading about supernatural occurrences, strange phenomena, trying to find anything that might explain what was happening to me. But the more I read, the more I realized that there was no explanation. Nothing that made sense. There were no answers. Just more questions, more confusion. And then one night, as the rain came pouring down again, I heard the voice, louder than before, almost as if it was inside my own head. "You've been avoiding me." I froze. My heart skipped a beat. It was closer now. I could hear it clearly, as if it were right behind me. "You can't hide forever. Come to me." I felt a wave of nausea wash over me. The voice, the words, they were like a force of nature, pulling me in, suffocating me. I couldn't breathe, couldn't think. My body moved on its own. Before I even realized what I was doing, I grabbed my jacket and rushed outside, the rain pouring down in sheets. It was dark. The streetlights flickered, casting long shadows across the pavement. I couldn't stop myself. I had to go to it. To the puddle. The streets were empty, the sound of the rain deafening. But in the distance, I saw it. The puddle. It had returned. I walked toward it, my body trembling, my mind fighting to break free of the compulsion. But it was too strong. The face was there, waiting for me, its eyes glistening with an unnatural gleam. It was as if it was expecting me. I couldn't turn back now. I had to face it. I had to end it. I crouched down slowly, the water in the puddle still and dark. The reflection was clearer now, more vivid than ever. The face wasn't just staring anymore. It was smiling. It was grinning, the mouth stretching wider, the eyes narrowing, as if it was pleased with what it had been waiting for. As if it knew exactly what I was about to do. I leaned in closer, my breath shallow, my hands clammy. The voice whispered again, only this time it wasn't a whisper. It was louder, more insistent, and it seemed to be inside my head, wrapping itself around my thoughts. "You can't escape me. You never could." The face in the puddle flickered, then twisted, the features shifting like a warped reflection in broken glass. I couldn't look away. It was too powerful. I was too weak. And then it happened. The face in the puddle began to stretch, its mouth widening even further, the eyes growing larger, until it was no longer just a face. It was a shape, an entity that seemed to crawl out of the water, its form rippling like liquid, its arms reaching out, dragging itself toward me. I couldn't move. I was paralyzed. I couldn't scream. My entire body was frozen in place, my mind caught in the grip of whatever had taken hold of me. It reached out, fingers extending from the water, and I felt the cold touch on my skin. The chill of it burned like ice, seeping into my bones, draining the warmth from my body. The face, it wasn't just in the puddle anymore. It was right in front of me, its features now grotesque, its eyes empty, but full of something I couldn't understand. I gasped for air, my lungs burning, but the touch, the pressure, kept pushing me closer to it, pulling me in. The voice, louder than ever, shouted inside my head. "You belong to me now." And as I stood there, unable to move, I realized with a sickening certainty that it wasn't just the puddle anymore. It was me. The face had consumed me. I don't know how much time passed. I lost track of reality, of time, of everything. All I could hear, all I could feel, was the cold touch of the face. The grip it had on me was suffocating, as though the very air was thick with its presence. I could no longer tell where the puddle ended and where I began. The line between the two had blurred, and I felt myself becoming a part of it. I tried to fight it. I tried to pull away, but it was futile. My body felt numb, as though the cold had seeped into my very bones, freezing me from the inside out. My mind was clouded, and the voice was all I could hear. "You're mine now," it whispered, its tone no longer distorted, but smooth and soothing. "You always were. You just didn't know it." I wanted to scream, to run, to escape, but my legs wouldn't move. My body wouldn't respond. I was trapped, caught in the puddle's grip, and I realized with growing horror that I had become part of it. I wasn't just looking at the face anymore, I was the face. I looked down at my hands, and they were wrong. They were no longer mine. They were pale, almost translucent, as if they belonged to someone who had never lived. My fingers, too long and thin, stretched unnaturally, and I felt a horrible shudder run through my entire body. I wasn't human anymore. I had become something else. The reflection in the puddle began to shift again. I watched, horrified, as the face in the water turned toward me. It was my face, but it wasn't. It was twisted, stretched in ways that shouldn't have been possible. The eyes were black, wide and hollow, devoid of any light. The smile, it was too wide, too cruel. I couldn't recognize it anymore. And then, as the face in the puddle moved closer, it spoke again. "You can't run from what you are." I screamed, or at least, I thought I did. But the sound was swallowed by the water, like it was never meant to be heard. My reflection, no, it smiled back at me, its eyes glowing in the darkness. And I understood. The puddle wasn't a place. It wasn't just a reflection. It was a doorway. A gateway. And I had walked straight into it. The world around me began to distort, the air thick with a heavy fog. The street lights above flickered, casting strange shadows across the water. And as I looked around, I saw them, shapes, figures, emerging from the edges of the puddle. They were like me, but not. They were reflections of people, their faces distorted, their bodies broken, trapped in the same way I was. The puddle had claimed them, too. I tried to scream, but the sound didn't come. I tried to run, but my feet wouldn't move. I couldn't escape. The puddle had claimed me, and now there was no way out. The figures in the water began to move, their eyes all turning toward me. They were waiting for me to join them, to become one with the reflection. I knew what they wanted. They wanted me to surrender, to let go. The voice came again, soft and sweet, like a lullaby. "We are all waiting for you. You're one of us now." I was no longer standing on the wet pavement. I was sinking, slowly, into the puddle, into the dark water, becoming a part of it. And as the last of the light disappeared, I realized with sickening clarity that I had never truly been alone. There was no escape. There was no way out. And the voice? It would never stop. Have you ever come across something that seemed like a clue to a mystery you never knew existed? A forgotten artifact, a half-faded map, a piece of something larger? That's exactly how it happened to me. It was an old map, yellowed with age, its edges torn and crinkled, but still legible. It was tucked away in a dusty corner of an antique shop I'd wandered into on a whim. At first glance, it appeared to be a simple map of a forest near my town, but as I studied it, something felt off. There were paths marked that I had never seen, strange symbols drawn in the corners, and a route that led deep into the woods where no one in town dared to go. Curiosity gnawed at me. I had been a bit restless lately, feeling as though I needed something to break the monotony of everyday life. The idea of exploring a part of the forest no one talked about, something hidden, excited me. What was the worst that could happen, right? I had no idea that my curiosity would soon become the start of something I would never forget. I decided to follow the map. The morning of my hike, the air was crisp and fresh, a perfect autumn day. The sun was barely up, casting long shadows as I set off toward the forest. The map seemed straightforward at first, just a winding trail that followed the edge of the woods. But the deeper I went, the more the trail seemed unfamiliar. Trees that I was sure I had passed earlier were now nowhere to be seen. The path wasn't matching up with the map, and the deeper I ventured, the more lost I felt. It didn't help that the forest was eerily quiet. The usual chirping of birds, the rustling of small animals in the underbrush, was completely absent. Only the faint crunch of my boots on the dry leaves broke the silence. The further I walked, the more I realized that I hadn't seen a single other person. I was alone, and the isolation settled heavily around me. The map's route, which had seemed like a simple exploration, was now becoming something else. The paths weren't as clear as they had appeared. At times, I would come to a fork in the trail, only to find that it didn't match the choices marked on the map. In the distance, I could hear the occasional creak of tree branches, but it felt wrong, like the forest itself was shifting around me, moving without me. I checked the map again, but something had changed. The lines on the map that had once been so neat and straightforward now seemed off. The paths had blurred, as though they were never meant to lead anywhere at all. I pressed on, my unease growing with every step. The forest felt different now, alive, in a way I had never experienced. A strange tension seemed to hang in the air, thick and suffocating. The trees stood taller, their twisted branches intertwining above me like claws reaching for the sky. The shadows between the trunks deepened, and I began to feel like I was being watched, though I couldn't explain why. And then I heard it, the faintest whisper, almost inaudible, but unmistakable. At first, I thought it was the wind, but there was something distinctly human about it. I stopped in my tracks, straining to hear. The whisper came again, and this time it was louder, clearer. It was a voice, a soft, unintelligible murmur, as though someone, or something, was speaking just out of reach. My heart began to race. I glanced around, but there was nothing there, just the endless stretch of trees and shadows. I hurried my pace, telling myself it was nothing, just my imagination running wild. But the deeper I went, the stronger the sensation became. It wasn't just a voice anymore. I could feel it, a creeping sensation, as though the very ground beneath me was shifting, pulling me further in. Every instinct in my body screamed at me to turn around, but the map, the strange, elusive map, kept me moving forward. The path began to narrow, the trees crowding in closer. It was as if the forest was trying to force me into a direction I hadn't planned on. My feet stumbled over uneven ground, and I looked up to see something that made my stomach drop, a figure in the distance, barely visible among the trunks of the trees. It wasn't a person, not exactly. It was a shape, indistinct at first, but as I stared, the figure began to take form. It was tall, impossibly tall, with long, spindly limbs and a shape that didn't seem quite human. The more I looked, the more I felt a sense of wrongness, as though this thing didn't belong in this world at all. I froze. My breath caught in my throat, and for a moment, I couldn't move. The figure, whatever it was, stood there, staring at me with something that resembled recognition. It didn't move, not yet, but I could feel its presence, its eyes, if it even had eyes, on me. A voice whispered again, this time directly in my ear. You should not have come. And that's when I realized I was no longer following the map. I wasn't in the forest anymore. I had crossed into something else. The trees, the ground beneath me, the air, they weren't the same. The forest wasn't just a place. It was something older, something that didn't want me to leave. I turned to run, but the path, which had been clear just moments before, was gone. The trees had closed in, the shadows now so thick I couldn't see more than a few feet ahead. The whispering voices grew louder, more insistent, as I tried desperately to retrace my steps. But with every turn, I found myself deeper in the forest, further from the world I knew. The map was no help. It was as though the forest had rewritten it, turned it into something else, something that no longer made sense. I wasn't sure how much time had passed when I finally stumbled across the clearing. The ground was soft, muddy, and the air felt thick with the weight of something watching. The figure was gone, but its presence still lingered. I felt a chill crawl up my spine, as if the forest was no longer just a forest. It was alive, and it was keeping me there. I found myself staring at the map again. But now, it was different. Its markings, its routes, its symbols were shifting before my eyes. The path that had seemed to lead out of the forest now seemed to loop back, over and over, leading only deeper into the unknown. The map was never meant to guide me out. I don't know how long I had been wandering. My feet ached, my head felt heavy with exhaustion, but still, I couldn't stop moving. The forest pressed in on me from all sides, its towering trees creating an impenetrable wall of shadow. The map had become an increasingly useless scrap of paper in my hand. Every time I checked it, the lines seemed to twist and shift, the path I had been following disappearing as though it had never existed. I didn't know which way was back, which direction would lead me to safety. The deeper I went, the more disorienting it became. The sounds of the forest had changed too. At first, it had been quiet, unnaturally so. Now, though, there was a constant murmur, whispers in the wind, rustlings in the trees. But when I turned to look, there was nothing. Just the oppressive silence that seemed to smother everything. The whispering wasn't just in the wind anymore. It was everywhere. Sometimes it sounded like a distant voice calling my name, soft and pleading. Other times, it was a low hum, almost like the earth itself was vibrating, pulsating under my feet. I paused for a moment, looking around. The trees here were unlike anything I'd seen before, bizarre, twisted things with gnarled roots that seemed to crawl across the ground like snakes. Their trunks were wide and thick, but instead of bark, they were covered in a strange, smooth surface, almost like skin. It was unnerving, to say the least. I stepped closer to one, running my fingers across the surface. It felt warm, almost alive. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up. I shook my head, trying to focus. I had to keep moving. The map showed a clearing ahead, a place marked with a strange symbol. I didn't know why, but I felt compelled to reach it. Maybe it would make sense of all this. Maybe it would lead me out of this madness. But as I pressed forward, the feeling of being watched intensified. Every time I glanced over my shoulder, I felt a presence, something following me, something just out of sight. I tried to convince myself it was just my imagination, but the sensation was too real, too strong. The deeper I went, the more my nerves frayed. Every rustling leaf, every crack of a twig felt like a threat. And the whispers, the voices were growing louder. I had no idea what time it was, but I knew it was late. The light had already begun to fade, and the forest felt even more oppressive in the dimming twilight. It was colder now, the air thick with a damp chill. I hugged my jacket tighter around my shoulders and continued walking, trying to ignore the growing unease. Then, I saw it. Through the thick trees, I spotted the clearing the map had promised. It was just as the paper had described, a wide open space, empty but for a few low bushes and a large, dark rock in the center. But as I stepped into the clearing, something felt wrong. The air was thick here, heavier somehow. The trees around the edge of the clearing seemed to bend inward, their branches stretching out like fingers, blocking any view of the outside world. I walked toward the rock in the center, drawn to it. As I got closer, I noticed something strange, carvings, intricate and detailed, etched into the surface. They weren't random. They formed a pattern, a circle that seemed to pulse with a quiet energy, as though they were alive. I reached out, touching one of the markings. My fingers tingled, the sensation sharp and uncomfortable. Stop. The voice was clear now, not a whisper, but a command. It came from all around me, reverberating through the trees, through the ground. I froze, my heart thudding in my chest. The voice sounded familiar, like my own, but distorted, twisted. I turned around, but there was nothing behind me. No one. Just the shifting shadows of the forest. But the air was thick now, suffocating. The trees seemed closer, their branches creeping toward me as if to trap me in place. My skin prickled with fear, and I couldn't breathe. Stop, before it's too late. I didn't understand. Who was speaking? What was happening? I looked down at the map again, but it was different now. The path I had been following was gone, replaced by something new, an endless loop, a spiral leading only deeper into the unknown. I glanced around the clearing again, feeling the weight of the eyes on me, the pressure of something ancient and powerful that I couldn't see. Suddenly, the ground beneath me shifted, the earth trembling. I stumbled back, my foot catching on something, and I fell hard to the ground. The moment I hit the ground, the whispering returned, louder than ever. The voices weren't just whispers anymore. They were words, clear, frantic, desperate. You shouldn't have come. It's too late to turn back. I scrambled to my feet, heart racing. The air around me felt like it was closing in, the shadows pressing in from every side. The clearing was no longer empty. Figures were emerging from the trees, shadows of people, faces twisted in agony. Their forms flickered in and out of sight, like mirages, but their eyes were locked on me, glowing faintly in the growing darkness. I turned, ready to flee, but the path I had come from had disappeared. The forest was no longer the same. The trees now loomed taller and closer, the air thick with an oppressive presence. It wasn't the forest anymore. It was something else. Something ancient. Something alive. I ran. But no matter how fast I moved, the forest seemed to shift around me. The trees grew closer, the path narrowed, and every step I took only seemed to lead me deeper into the unknown. The map that had seemed like a guide, was now useless. There was no escape. There was only the pull of the forest, dragging me further in. And as I ran, I heard the voice again, clear as day. You'll never leave. I stopped dead in my tracks, my heart hammering in my chest. I couldn't run anymore. I couldn't escape. And I realized, with sickening clarity, that the forest wasn't just a place. It was a trap. And I was already caught. I stood frozen, my breath catching in my throat, my mind reeling. I had heard the voice before, but now it felt different, deeper, more insistent, as if it were coming from the very trees themselves. The ground beneath me seemed to shift, like the forest was alive, breathing with me. I couldn't see anything beyond the darkness, the shapes of the trees obscuring everything else. I had no sense of direction anymore, no way of knowing where I had come from or where I was going. The figures, shadows of people, had stopped moving. They just stood there, their eyes glowing faintly, staring at me with an intensity that made my skin crawl. The quiet whispering from the trees had faded, but I could still feel the weight of it, hanging in the air like a heavy fog. The forest wasn't silent anymore. It was alive with sounds I couldn't quite place, low moans, creaking branches, the distant crack of twigs snapping underfoot, but there was no one there. I turned slowly, my legs trembling beneath me. I tried to steady myself, but my mind was clouded with panic. Every fiber of my being screamed at me to run, to get out of this cursed place, but where? The forest seemed endless, its branches weaving into a maze with no clear exit. I had no idea which direction was safe, which way led to anything familiar. I looked at the map again, though I knew it wouldn't help me. The lines had blurred even more now, as if the paper itself had absorbed the darkness of the forest. The path that had seemed so clear when I first found it was now a jumbled mess of illegible markings. It was useless. The forest had taken control. It was guiding me now, and I had no say in where I was going. I clutched the map in my hands, feeling its edges crinkle under my fingers. I needed to think. I needed to make a plan. But the more I tried to clear my thoughts, the more they raced, like a whirlwind of fear and confusion. I needed to escape, but I didn't know how. The whispering returned. You can't leave. The voice was louder now, as if it was right behind me. I spun around, but there was no one there. The figures were gone, the shadows swallowed by the thick darkness. I wasn't alone, though. I could feel it. The presence, the weight of something watching me, listening to every breath I took. You shouldn't have followed the map. I shivered, the words echoing in my mind like a curse. I didn't understand. What was happening? Why had this place turned on me? I had thought the map was a simple guide, a way to explore the unknown, to experience something new. But now it felt like the forest had been waiting for me, drawing me in, trapping me in its grasp. Suddenly, the trees around me groaned, their branches twisting and contorting as if they were reaching for me. I could feel the air thickening, pressing down on me from all sides. I had to move. I didn't know how, but I had to find a way out. Without thinking, I turned and began to run. My footsteps were muffled by the damp earth, but the forest seemed to be closing in around me. The branches lashed out, grabbing at my clothes, pulling me back. I struggled, trying to break free, but the trees were relentless. I could feel the weight of them on me, the pressure building, squeezing the air from my lungs. The whispering grew louder, more frantic, urging me to stop. You can't outrun it. The voice echoed in my mind, sending chills down my spine. It knows where you are. It's always known. I couldn't stop. I wouldn't stop. I had to get away. My heart was pounding in my chest, and I could feel sweat trickling down my back. I stumbled, my foot catching on something hidden in the undergrowth, and I fell hard to the ground. For a moment, everything went dark as the wind was knocked out of me. My hands scraped against the dirt, trying to push myself back up, but I couldn't breathe. My chest felt tight, as though the very forest was squeezing the life out of me. I heard something else then. A low, guttural growl. It was closer now. Much closer. I turned my head, eyes wide with terror. I could see it in the dark, a shape moving through the trees, slow, deliberate, like a predator stalking its prey. The growl was deafening, sending waves of fear through my body. I scrambled to my feet, my heart racing. The trees around me seemed to part as I ran, but the shape, whatever it was always just behind me, just out of reach. I couldn't look back. I had to keep running. The ground beneath me began to slope downward, and I didn't know where it would lead. But the growl was getting louder, closer. It was coming for me. And the voices in my head were getting louder too, their words becoming more frantic. You can't outrun it. I glanced at the map again. The lines had twisted into a spiral, forming a strange symbol at the center. My mind raced. What did it mean? What was I missing? What had I gotten myself into? The air grew colder, the wind picking up. I could feel it, the eyes watching me again. The forest was alive, shifting around me, pushing me towards something. Something waiting in the dark. And then, I saw it, a flicker of light through the trees. It was faint, but it was there, and it seemed to be coming from a distance. Maybe a way out. Maybe something that would break the grip the forest had on me. I pushed forward, the growl growing louder in my ears, but the light was my only hope. I ran faster, each step a desperate plea to escape. But the forest wasn't done with me yet. The light flickered again, and then, just as suddenly, it disappeared. The forest swallowed it whole, leaving me in the darkness once more. And that was when I heard it, soft at first, but growing clearer with each passing second. The sound of footsteps. My own. But they weren't mine. The sound of footsteps behind me was unmistakable. They were slow, deliberate, matching my pace exactly, but they weren't mine. I spun around, my heart pounding in my chest, but there was nothing, just the dense trees and the dark, oppressive quiet of the forest. Yet I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone, that something was following me, always just a step behind. I quickened my pace, my breath shallow and ragged. My feet stumbled over roots and rocks as I ran blindly through the underbrush. The growl from earlier had ceased, but the air was thick with an eerie, suffocating silence. The forest seemed to close in around me, the trees twisting in on themselves, the shadows lengthening as though they were alive. The footsteps continued. I wasn't imagining it. The sound of someone, or something, moving just behind me, never too far away, but never close enough for me to catch a glimpse. My pulse hammered in my ears, drowning out all other sounds, and I felt the weight of something watching me, stalking me, drawing closer with every step I took. I could feel it now, the presence behind me. It was no longer just a sound. It was a weight, a force that pressed down on me, forcing me to move faster, to keep running even though I didn't know where I was going. My legs burned with exhaustion, my breath coming in sharp gasps, but I didn't dare stop. The footsteps were too close. I couldn't let whatever it was catch up to me. I glanced over my shoulder, but again, nothing. Only the endless expanse of trees and shadows. I was trapped in a forest. The trees weren't just trees anymore. They were watching me, listening, closing in with every step I took. The map. I had to look at the map again. I pulled it out of my pocket, my hands trembling as I unfolded the fragile paper. The lines seemed to be moving, shifting, like the ink was alive. The path I had been following was no longer there. It was gone, replaced with a new route, one I didn't recognize, one that seemed to wind deeper into the forest, into the heart of something waiting. I couldn't trust the map anymore. The forest had changed it, twisted it into something else, something that didn't make sense. The forest was controlling me, manipulating me, leading me further and further from any hope of escape. I shoved the map back into my pocket, panic setting in as I realized I had no clear direction anymore. The air was thick with the smell of damp earth, and the darkness seemed to stretch endlessly before me. I couldn't see anything clearly anymore. The trees were too close, their branches reaching toward me like skeletal hands, their gnarled fingers brushing against my skin. And then, there it was. A figure, standing in the shadows between two trees. Its shape was vague at first, but as I stumbled forward, it became clearer. A person. No, it wasn't a person. The figure was too tall, too thin, its limbs too long and unnaturally bent. The face was hidden in the darkness, but I could feel its eyes on me, watching, waiting. I froze. I couldn't breathe. My heart felt like it was going to burst out of my chest. I wanted to scream, to run, but my body wouldn't move. The figure didn't move either. It just stood there, its head tilting to one side, as if it were studying me. And then, in the silence, I heard a whisper. "You're not supposed to be here." The voice was cold, inhuman, and it sent a chill through my bones. I tried to take a step back, but my feet felt like they were glued to the ground. The figure took a step forward, its limbs bending in strange angles as it moved closer, the shadows around it growing darker, more oppressive. "You shouldn't have followed the map." The whisper was louder now, a low, almost growling voice that vibrated in my skull. The figure was right in front of me now, its face still hidden in the darkness, but I could feel its presence, like it was inside me, controlling my every thought. "You should have turned back when you had the chance." It raised one of its long, twisted arms and pointed a bony finger at me, its finger trembling with an unnatural energy. I tried to scream, to move, but it was like I was trapped in place, my body frozen in fear. The figure stepped closer, its breath cold against my skin, and I could feel its eyes, empty and black, boring into me, pulling me into the darkness. I couldn't take it anymore. I had to move. I had to get away from it. With a desperate burst of energy, I pulled myself away from the figure, stumbling back, my feet finally working again. I ran. I didn't look back. The darkness behind me was suffocating, the sounds of the forest closing in around me, the growls and whispers growing louder with every step I took. The forest was alive, and it was hunting me. I couldn't keep running forever. I had to find a way out. The map, the figure, the forest itself, they were all leading me deeper, pulling me into something that I couldn't understand. My mind was spinning, my heart racing, and all I could think about was escaping, but I didn't know where to go. The air grew colder, the wind picking up again, and I realized that the footsteps had returned. I wasn't alone anymore. The figure was following me. The forest was following me. I didn't know how much longer I could keep going, but I couldn't stop. Not now. I had to survive. I could feel the weight of the forest pressing down on me, as if the very trees were closing in, making the air harder to breathe. The map was useless now. It had become just another piece of paper, lost among the shadows and the thicket. The path was gone. There was no direction anymore, only the suffocating darkness and the ever-present sound of something moving just behind me. I didn't dare look back. The whispers had returned, soft at first, like a rustling in the leaves, but growing louder with each passing moment. They weren't human. The voice wasn't human. It came from everywhere and nowhere, threading through the wind, mixing with the sounds of the forest, and it crawled beneath my skin. You can't leave. The words were sharp, clear now, as if the voice was speaking directly into my ear. My heart skipped a beat. I stumbled, tripping over a rock, and fell hard onto the forest floor. My hand scraped against the rough earth, and the pain shot through my palms, but I didn't have time to feel it. My breath came in ragged gasps as I scrambled to my feet, pushing myself upright. I had to keep going. I wiped my hand across my face, brushing away the sweat and the dirt, and looked around. The forest seemed different. The trees, the ground, it was all wrong. The map, the figure, the endless maze of the forest, it wasn't leading me out. It was drawing me deeper, deeper into something ancient, something I didn't understand. Suddenly, I saw it. A clearing, just ahead, bathed in pale moonlight. It felt like an escape, a way out, but I knew better now. Nothing in this forest was what it seemed. I walked toward the clearing, every step heavy, my body trembling. The sound of the footsteps had stopped. The whispers, too. The silence was deafening, and in that silence, I could feel the weight of the forest watching me, waiting for me to make a mistake. I stepped into the clearing, my eyes scanning the surroundings. The trees here were different, thicker, older. Their trunks were twisted, their roots winding out of the ground like serpents. And in the center of the clearing, something was there. A stone structure. A monument, half buried beneath the underbrush, its surface covered in strange markings. I stepped closer, drawn to it, my fingers itching to touch the carvings. The air grew colder, and the wind began to pick up again, howling through the clearing, as if warning me to turn back. But I couldn't. I had to understand. The moment my fingers brushed against the stone, a wave of energy shot through me. I felt it all at once, the cold, the darkness, the whispers that now flooded my mind. The forest, the figure, the map, it all made sense, but it wasn't something I could comprehend. Not fully. You shouldn't have come. The voice was louder now, more urgent. It was no longer a whisper. It was a command. The stone began to tremble beneath my hand, and I felt the ground beneath me shift. The trees groaned, and the air grew thick with an unnatural weight. I pulled my hand away, but it was too late. The ground beneath me cracked open with a deafening roar, the earth splitting apart as if the forest itself were tearing open. From the cracks, something rose. A shape, a shadow, no, more than that. It was a figure, but not like the one I had seen before. This one was massive, towering above me, its features obscured by darkness. Its limbs stretched far beyond what was natural, and its eyes, if they could be called eyes, burned with an intensity that was more than human. It moved toward me, and I couldn't move. I was frozen, my body refusing to obey my mind. The whispers became a cacophony, overwhelming me, filling my head with 1,000 voices all at once. I couldn't breathe, couldn't think. I wanted to run, but my legs wouldn't work. The figure stopped before me. Its presence was suffocating. The forest around us seemed to hold its breath. "You are mine now," it whispered, and I could feel the words wrapping around me like chains. "You were never meant to leave." The world seemed to tilt, and I stumbled backward, my vision blurring. The figure was still there, looming over me, but everything was starting to fade. The trees, the sky, the very ground beneath my feet, all of it was dissolving into nothingness, like a dream slipping away. And then, nothing. When I opened my eyes again, I was back where I had started. The forest was silent. The map, the footsteps, the figure, none of it was real. It was all gone, and I was alone, standing in the clearing. But I knew that I hadn't left. I hadn't escaped. I was still in the forest. The map had never been a guide. It had been a trap. And now, I was part of the forest. Have you ever received a gift that felt wrong? Not in the obvious sense, not in a way that could be easily explained, but in that quiet, unsettling way that sticks with you long after you've unwrapped it? That was how I felt the moment I saw the candle. It was simple, an ivory wax candle with no scent, just an almost perfect cylinder sitting atop a plain silver holder. At first, I didn't think much of it. After all, it was a gift from a friend, a birthday gift, meant to be nothing more than a nice gesture. But as soon as I lit it, something changed. The light from the candle didn't behave like a normal flame. It didn't flicker and dance the way a candle should. No, this flame burned steadily, unwavering, as if it had a life of its own. And at night, when the shadows began to stretch across my room, the shadows it cast, they didn't belong. I remember the first night it happened. I had just settled into bed, tired from a long day of work. The candle sat on the nightstand next to my bed, its warm light casting gentle, soft shadows on the walls. The room was quiet, almost too quiet, save for the soft hum of the streetlight outside my window. But then, the shadows began to shift. It started with the shape of a figure. At first, it was faint, a silhouette, a vague shape that seemed to move with the flickering of the candle. I sat up in bed, watching as the shadow stretched, growing longer, darker, until it looked almost like a person standing near the corner of the room. I blinked, but when I opened my eyes, it was gone. I told myself it was just the angle of the light, that I was imagining things. But deep down, I knew something wasn't right. The next night, the shadows returned. But this time, they weren't as benign. The shape that appeared was clearer now, almost human in form, but it was distorted, twisted. It was like watching a scene from a nightmare, something familiar yet completely wrong. The figure moved as if it were alive, walking across my wall, pausing at the edge of my vision, and then disappearing as the candlelight shifted. I could feel my heart racing, but I couldn't tear my eyes away. I tried to ignore it at first. I thought maybe I was just tired, or maybe I had seen something out of the corner of my eye. But as the days passed, the occurrences became harder to dismiss. The shadows started to mimic my actions, replaying moments from my life. At first, it was harmless. I would see myself sitting at the kitchen table, reading, and then the shadow would replay the same scene, except it would always end with something different. One time, the shadow of me at the table fell, crashing to the floor as if the chair had been kicked out from under me. Another time, I saw myself walking to the door, and in the shadow, I collapsed before I could reach the handle. Every time, something went wrong, something disastrous. It was always a fateful ending. The most disturbing part? The shadows weren't always from things I had done. Sometimes they showed things I hadn't yet experienced, things that were still to come. The candle wasn't just casting shadows of the past, it was showing me the future. That night, after seeing yet another shadow replay a moment I had not yet lived, I couldn't sleep. I lay there, staring at the candle, trying to make sense of what was happening. The room felt colder now, the air heavier, as though the shadows had seeped out of the walls and were closing in on me. I wanted to blow out the candle, to rid myself of the constant haunting projections, but something stopped me. It was as though the flame was alive, watching me, waiting for me to do something. I reached out for the candle, my fingers trembling, but the moment I touched the wick, a sudden coldness gripped me. The room seemed to shift, the walls warping, the shadows stretching into unnatural shapes. I pulled my hand back, but it was too late. The shadows on the wall grew longer, swirling in a frenzy, and I heard something. A whisper. "You can't escape." I froze, my blood turning to ice. The voice was faint, but it was clear. It wasn't in my head. It was real. I quickly jumped out of bed, grabbing the candle and moving it to the center of the room, away from the walls. But no matter where I placed it, the shadows didn't stop. They spread, they grew, they twisted and writhed like something sentient. The flame burned brighter, its light flickering with an intensity that felt like it was burning into my very soul. "You will never be free," the voice whispered again, louder this time, coming from all around me. I backed away slowly, feeling the weight of the presence in the room growing stronger, pressing against me, suffocating me. The shadows were closing in. There was no escaping them. And as I watched, the shadows began to move in a way that was unmistakable. They were showing me something inevitable. A scene from my future. My death. The flame flickered again, and I saw it. The shadow of my own body, lying lifeless on the floor, the candle still burning beside me. The shadows danced around me, mocking me, as if they had known all along what would happen. That night, I blew out the candle, but the flame didn't go out. It never went out. The candle stayed lit. I stared at it in disbelief, my mind racing. I had blown on it with all my might, even smothered the flame with my hand, but it didn't matter. It continued to burn, its flame unwavering, glowing with a cold, almost malicious light. The shadows it cast only grew more vivid, creeping across the room in unnatural ways, as though they had a life of their own. I couldn't understand it. I couldn't explain it. How could a simple candle burn endlessly? And why were its shadows showing me things I had never experienced? Things I was afraid would come to pass? I wanted to throw the candle away, to destroy it, but something held me back. A deep, gnawing sense that if I did, I might unleash something far worse. The whispering voice, the cold presence in the room, all of it felt connected to the flame. It was as though it had a grip on me now, something invisible but tangible, tightening around my chest with every passing moment. I spent the next few days in a fog, unable to sleep or focus. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the shadows. The figure of myself lying motionless on the floor. The voice that whispered, "You will never be free." I tried to act normal, to convince myself that I had imagined it all. But deep down, I knew it wasn't just a nightmare. It was something real. The candle, the shadows, the predictions, they weren't random. They were meant for me, for something that was going to happen. I decided to investigate. If there was one thing I could do to fight back, it was find the truth. I began searching for any information I could find about the candle. A gift like this couldn't exist without a reason, a history. I went to the library, combing through old books, dusty journals, and anything I could find that might offer an explanation. It took days, but eventually I found a reference to a strange type of candle. It was mentioned in a small, obscure journal, one filled with forgotten myths and local legends. The candle was known as a fate seer. According to the journal, such candles were cursed. They were created by an ancient order, gifted with the power to show the future in the form of shadows. However, the future they showed was never kind. The visions were always fatal, always inevitable, and the person who owned the candle would become trapped, watching their fate unfold in horrifying detail until the end. The journal said nothing about how to break the curse. In fact, it didn't offer much hope at all. The only thing it suggested was that the candle could be extinguished, but not by the hands of the person it had chosen. The flame would die only when it had fulfilled its purpose. I could feel the weight of that truth pressing on me. The candle was tied to my fate, and no matter how hard I tried to escape, it wouldn't let me go. That night, I made up my mind to end it. I couldn't keep living like this, terrified of every shadow, every flicker of the flame. I couldn't let the candle show me more of what was to come. But as I reached for it, something shifted. The shadows began to move again, faster now, as though they sensed my determination. They grew longer, twisting and pulling at the air around me, forming shapes, figures. One of them wasn't me this time. It was someone else. A figure in the shadows, looming over me, its face hidden in darkness. The air grew thick with a presence that was far more oppressive than anything I had felt before. The voice came again, but this time it was not a whisper. It was a roar, a deep, guttural sound that filled the room. You can't stop it. It's already begun. I backed away, my heart racing, as the shadowy figure took shape. It was tall, towering over me, its features barely visible. But I could feel its eyes, cold, endless eyes that bore into my soul. I was frozen in place, too terrified to move, to breathe. I couldn't escape it. The candle, the curse, it was too much. I had been running from it, trying to fight it, but now I understood. There was no escaping fate. There was no outrunning what had already been set in motion. The figure reached out, its hand extending toward me. I tried to scream, but the sound caught in my throat. It was as though the room had swallowed my voice. The shadows closed in tighter, and I could see the figure's face now, only it wasn't a face at all. It was just darkness, endless, suffocating darkness, consuming everything in its path. The candle flickered once, and for a brief moment, I thought it might finally go out. But then it flared up again, brighter than ever, casting the room in an almost blinding light. And in that light, I saw it. The end. It was no longer a vision. It was happening. I was no longer alone in the room. The figure lunged at me, and I was powerless to stop it. The shadows wrapped around me, pulling me in, suffocating me. And as I was pulled into the darkness, I heard the voice one last time. You can't escape. And then, nothing. When I woke up, it was as if I had been pulled from the depths of a nightmare. I gasped for air, heart pounding in my chest. The room was quiet, eerily so. The shadows were gone, and the candle was still burning, its flame steady and unwavering. For a moment, I thought I had imagined everything, the dark figure, the suffocating presence, the voice that had promised me there was no escape. But then I noticed something. The air around me felt colder, and there was a weight in my chest that hadn't been there before. The shadows on the walls were moving again, only this time they weren't showing events from the past or the future. They were different. They weren't just projections, they were memories of me, memories of moments I had lived, moments I hadn't realized were being shaped by the candle all along. I stood up shakily, my legs weak, and turned toward the flame. It flickered once, as though it sensed my hesitation, then steadied itself, casting a faint glow over the room. But this time, I didn't feel the same fear. Something in me had changed. The curse was real. I understood that now. And no matter how much I tried to fight it, there was no way to escape it. The shadows on the walls were telling me everything. Each figure, each movement, was a part of the inevitable chain of events leading to my end. I had been shown the future, and I had been powerless to change it. It wasn't just a curse. It was a warning, a path I had already walked, one that led to the same conclusion, no matter what choices I made. I had to accept it. I had to let it happen. But the thought of living through it again, watching the same events unfold with no ability to stop them, it felt like drowning. In that moment, a realization washed over me, one that I couldn't deny. The candle's purpose wasn't to show me the future. It was to force me to witness my fate over and over again until there was no room for hope. The flame was no longer just a light. It was my prison. I couldn't fight it anymore. I had tried to destroy it, to break free, but now I understood. The candle didn't belong to me. It was part of me, a part that I couldn't escape. The figure in the shadows had been a manifestation of my own fear, my own inability to let go of the illusion that I could change the course of my life. I sat down beside the candle, the cold air still clinging to me, and watched the shadows move. It would all end the same way. The voice whispered in my mind again, softer now. You can't change what's meant to be. And for the first time, I didn't resist. The shadows grew darker, the figures clearer, and I saw myself again. But this time, I wasn't afraid. I accepted what was coming. The end. The candle continued to burn, but now I knew that the flame, the shadows, and everything in between were not just part of the curse, they were my fate. A fate that could never be outrun, no matter how hard I tried. And as the shadows consumed me once more, I finally understood that the candle's flame would never go out. Not until I did. The moments after that realization felt like an eternity, but they also felt like nothing at all. I sat there, watching the candle flicker softly in the dim room, its light casting long, wavering shadows that danced across the walls. There was no sound except for the occasional crackle of the flame, but it wasn't peaceful. It was suffocating, each movement of the flame adding weight to the air around me. I tried to stand, but my legs wouldn't move. I felt anchored to the floor as if the very foundation of the house had become part of me. I couldn't escape. I couldn't change the future, couldn't stop the shadows that crept along the walls. They were always there, always waiting to pull me back into the cycle. And then it happened again. The shadows on the walls shifted and changed, as if guided by an unseen hand, each one taking the shape of an event from my past. At first, it was small, insignificant things, me walking home from work, sitting in my room reading a book, the hum of life moving all around me. But soon, those shadows began to distort, their edges becoming jagged, their movements erratic. I could see myself in them, but it was a different version of me, one that wasn't so certain of the future. I could hear whispers now, soft voices, like a crowd murmuring in the distance. The figures on the walls moved faster, taking on a life of their own. A face in the shadows shifted into a distorted version of mine, a grotesque reflection of what I had become in the wake of all this. The whispering grew louder, louder still, until the voices became screams. But none of it mattered. I was still trapped, still bound to this cursed candle, its endless flame illuminating my inevitable fate. The future was set, written in shadows, and I couldn't change a single thing. A shift in the air, the weight of it, warned me of the presence I felt closing in. The room grew colder, the darkness deeper. It was no longer just a projection on the walls. It was here, in the room with me. The figure from my nightmares, the one I had seen before, was now standing in front of me. It was a part of the shadows, a manifestation of the very thing I couldn't outrun. Its face was blank, featureless, but I could feel its gaze, its stare, piercing through me. I opened my mouth to speak, but no words came. The flame flickered again, and the figure took a step closer. Its presence seemed to suck the warmth from the room until there was nothing left but a cold, oppressive silence. "Why?" I managed to whisper, my voice weak and trembling. "Why is this happening to me?" The figure tilted its head, as if considering the question. Its form seemed to waver, its shape almost slipping out of focus as if it were a mirage. Then it spoke, not with words, but with an emotion, a sensation that filled the room. "You sought the truth," it said, though I didn't hear it in my ears. It was in my mind, in my heart, a whisper of thought that shook my very core. "And now you know. There is no escape. No change. Only the path that awaits you." The room grew darker, and the shadow began to stretch toward me. I couldn't move, couldn't scream. My chest tightened, as if the air had been drained from the room, and for a moment I thought I might suffocate in that cold, empty space. But then, just as quickly as it had appeared, the figure began to fade. The shadows melted back into the walls, and the flame of the candle steadied once more, casting light in every corner of the room. The air slowly returned to its normal, familiar heaviness. I was alone again. But the sense of dread still lingered, thick and suffocating. It wasn't over. The figure was gone, but its presence remained, echoing in the corners of my mind. The path hadn't changed. The future still awaited, relentless and unforgiving. I had only seen a glimpse of what was to come, but I knew now. No matter what I did, no matter how hard I fought, the future would come for me. The candle would never go out. And neither would the shadows. I spent that night sitting in the same spot, staring at the candle as if it held the key to everything. The whispers from the shadows still echoed in my mind, relentless, impossible to escape. I kept telling myself that it wasn't real, that it was just my imagination, a twisted trick of the light, but the weight of it, the sheer suffocating force of that presence, told me otherwise. The candle continued to burn, its flame steady, mocking me with its eternal glow. I couldn't look away. I couldn't stop watching. It was as if the flame was the only thing keeping me tethered to reality, yet at the same time, it was the very thing that was dragging me deeper into the abyss. I tried to move. I stood up, but my legs felt weak, as though they had forgotten how to support me. I stumbled towards the door, my hand reaching out for the handle, but before I could touch it, the room seemed to tilt, and the air turned ice cold again. I heard it, a faint whisper, a voice, but not from the shadows this time. It was real. I turned, my heart racing, and there, standing just at the edge of the light, was a figure. I couldn't make out its features, just a silhouette, shrouded in the same darkness that had consumed the room before. My breath caught in my throat as I recognized the outline. It was me. No, not exactly me, but it felt like it. The figure stood still, its head tilted in the same way as the shadow from before. I could feel its gaze, as if it were studying me, waiting for me to react. "Why are you here?" I asked, my voice trembling. It didn't answer. Instead, it took a step forward, and the ground beneath me seemed to tremble. My pulse quickened. I wanted to run, but my feet felt as if they were glued to the floor. The figure moved closer, and I felt a coldness wash over me. It wasn't like the chill from before. This was different. It was deep, suffocating, like the very essence of death itself was closing in. "Please," I whispered, my voice breaking. "I don't want this." The figure reached out, its hand stretching toward me, and I could feel the darkness in its touch. But I didn't resist. I couldn't. My body wouldn't move, my mind too lost in the terror to fight back. And then, just as its fingers brushed against my skin, I saw it. The flame of the candle flickered, just for a moment, but in that instant, I saw the future. I saw the path I was meant to walk, the path that had already been set in motion. I saw the faces, the moments, the choices I had made and would make, all leading to this point. There was no way out. There never had been. The figure smiled. Or, at least, I think it smiled. Its face twisted, its features contorting in a way that shouldn't have been possible. The smile stretched wider, its mouth gaping impossibly large, as if it were not a face at all, but a void, a hole that devoured everything in its path. The room around me disappeared. The walls, the floor, the ceiling, they all faded, leaving only the flickering light of the candle and the endless darkness. The figure loomed closer, and I felt the pull of inevitability, the crushing weight of fate that I couldn't escape. And then it spoke, its voice not in words, but in a feeling, a cold, empty certainty. It was always meant to be this way. I screamed, but the sound was swallowed by the void. The candle burned brighter, its flame more intense than ever before, and I could feel the shadows pulling me in. There was no escape. No turning back. I thought I heard a voice, someone calling my name, a distant echo from the real world. But it was too late. The candle's light burned through me, through everything I was, and I was consumed by the shadows. The flame never went out, and neither did the darkness. Have you ever been alone in the woods, where the silence feels so thick you could almost cut it with a knife? I had always found comfort in the solitude of nature. The rustling of leaves, the chirping of birds, the wind brushing through the branches, these sounds were like a symphony to me. But one particular day, everything changed. It started like any other walk in the forest. The sun was still high in the sky, casting long shadows through the trees. I had walked this path many times before, a familiar trail that wound deep into the heart of the woods. The scent of pine and damp earth filled my lungs as I pushed onward, my boots crunching the dry leaves beneath my feet. But something felt different that day. I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. At first, it was subtle. A faint rustling behind me that I dismissed as the wind, or perhaps an animal. But it persisted, just a little too steady to be natural. I stopped, turned, and peered through the trees, but all I saw was the same dense forest I had been walking through. No movement. No life. I shrugged it off and continued. Maybe it was nothing. Just my mind playing tricks on me. As I ventured deeper into the woods, I began to hear something else. At first, it was so faint I wasn't sure if I was hearing it at all. A whisper. A voice on the wind? No, it was too rhythmic, too deliberate. It seemed to be calling my name. I stopped dead in my tracks, my heart suddenly pounding. I turned again, scanning the shadows between the trees, but there was no one there. The whisper came again, this time clearer, as if it were right beside me. "Ethan." My breath caught in my throat. How could anyone be out here? I hadn't seen another soul for miles. My hands instinctively reached out to steady myself against the trunk of a nearby tree. The bark felt rough under my palms, grounding me, but the whisper, the voice, it wouldn't stop. Ethan. It was my name, unmistakably, but there was something wrong about the way it was spoken. The voice was not kind. It was not friendly. It was insistent, demanding, almost like a beckoning. I told myself it was just the wind again, or maybe the branches creaking in the breeze. But there was a weight to it now, a heaviness in the air that I couldn't ignore. The trees felt closer, as though they were leaning in, pressing in on me. I could feel their presence in a way I never had before. The whisper grew louder, sharper, more urgent. It was no longer a distant voice. It was all around me, echoing in the trees, swirling in the air, until it seemed to come from inside my head. Ethan, come closer. I took a step back, but my legs felt heavy, unwilling to move. Something was pulling me forward. The path ahead had always been clear, but now it seemed to twist, to curve in on itself, like the forest was changing shape, shaping itself into a maze that would trap me forever. I glanced around again, hoping to spot some sign of another person, anyone, but there was nothing. Just the trees. They stood like silent sentinels, their branches swaying gently in the breeze, yet there was an unnatural stillness in the air. It felt like the forest was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. The whisper didn't stop. Instead, it grew louder, more insistent, like an animal's call, drawing me in. Ethan, you belong here, with us. My heart raced. A cold sweat broke out across my skin. This wasn't right. This wasn't normal. I had to leave. I had to get out. But the deeper I went, the more I felt something guiding me, pushing me onward. The trees no longer felt like just trees. They were watching me, waiting for me to come closer. And I did. I don't know why. Maybe it was curiosity. Maybe it was fear. But I stepped forward, my feet moving of their own accord, carrying me deeper into the forest where the light barely touched the ground. The whispers swirled around me, urging me forward. And then, through the dense foliage, I saw something strange. A figure. It was a silhouette, standing in the distance, barely visible through the trees. But it wasn't a person. It couldn't have been. The figure was tall, unnaturally tall, and as it moved, the shadows around it seemed to stretch, bend, and follow its every step. I froze, watching as it turned its head slowly, its eyes glowing faintly, like two pinpricks of light in the darkness. Ethan. The voice whispered my name again, this time from behind me. But it wasn't the figure. No, it was the trees themselves. The branches seemed to stretch out like arms, and I could swear they were moving toward me, reaching for me, as if they were alive. And they were. The trees weren't just whispering, they were calling me. And I couldn't escape. I tried to turn, to run, but my body felt like it was rooted to the ground. Every movement was sluggish, as if the air itself had thickened, resisting me, holding me in place. The whispers, now a chorus, were all around me, filling the forest with a dreadful, unrelenting sound. Stay with us, Ethan. I couldn't tell if the voice was coming from the trees or from the ground beneath my feet, but it felt like it was inside my mind, burrowing deep into my thoughts, like it was pulling at something inside me, something I didn't even know was there. The figure in the distance, if that's even what it was, continued to move, its tall, thin form shifting with unnatural grace, as though it was made of shadow rather than flesh. It began to approach me slowly, its feet barely making a sound as they touched the forest floor. I wanted to scream. I wanted to run. But something was preventing me from doing either. "Ethan, don't leave," the voice begged, now soft and coaxing, like a lover's whisper. "We've been waiting for you." My heart hammered in my chest, and I could feel the cold sweat running down my spine. The trees creaked around me, as though stretching their limbs toward me, the very air vibrating with a low hum, a rhythm that made my skin crawl. And then the figure stopped. It stood perfectly still, staring at me with those glowing eyes that were like twin lanterns burning in the dark. Its gaze felt like it was seeping into me, freezing me in place. I couldn't move. I couldn't speak. "Ethan, come closer," it murmured again, its voice now both everywhere and nowhere, echoing in the deepest corners of my mind. I didn't know what was happening anymore. The world around me was shifting, becoming disjointed. The trees weren't just whispering, they were calling to each other, to something beyond me, something older than the forest itself. I could hear their branches groaning, the wind rustling through their leaves like a chorus of voices, all speaking the same name. "Ethan." I couldn't take it anymore. My legs finally moved, but not in the direction I wanted them to. I took a step toward the figure, unable to resist the pull, the compulsion. It was as if the forest itself was guiding my every step, leading me toward whatever it was that waited for me. The figure moved again, its head tilting slightly, as if curious, watching my approach with unsettling calmness. I was so close now. Too close. The air was colder, and the shadows around me seemed darker, more oppressive. The figure's eyes, those bright, gleaming lights, were the only thing I could see now. Everything else was consumed by darkness. The whispers grew louder, more urgent. They were no longer distant murmurs. They were right next to me. They were inside me. "Don't go," they begged. "Stay with us." I felt a sudden rush of panic. I tried to stop, to fight against the pull, but it was too strong. I couldn't break free. And then, as I stood just a few feet away from the figure, the air seemed to split with a sound like cracking wood, and the world around me seemed to collapse. The trees, once towering and majestic, now felt like they were closing in on me, their bark twisted, their branches reaching like claws, grasping at me, pulling me closer to the figure. It was standing in front of me now, its features still blurred by the darkness, but its presence, its overwhelming presence, was undeniable. It seemed to grow taller as I stood there, my legs shaking beneath me. It was as though the forest was breathing, its very pulse matching mine. And then it spoke, its voice like the rustling of dead leaves, sharp and final. "You belong here, Ethan. With us. Forever." Before I could comprehend what it meant, a cold wind swept through the forest, and the ground beneath my feet began to tremble. The trees moaned and creaked as if they were alive, shifting, closing in. My breath caught in my throat. I knew then there was no escape. Suddenly, everything was still. The wind stopped. The trees fell silent. The figure stood motionless in front of me, its glowing eyes the only thing I could see. And then, slowly, it reached out. Its fingers were long and twisted, like branches themselves, stretching toward me, and I could feel the pull on my chest, the sensation of being drawn into its grasp. I couldn't breathe. I couldn't think. I couldn't move. Its hand touched my arm, cold as ice, and a shock of energy shot through my body, paralyzing me. The world around me blurred, and the forest seemed to pulse, its heartbeat matching mine. The whispers in my ears grew louder until they were all I could hear. Ethan, you will never leave. You are ours now. And in that moment, I understood. The trees weren't just calling my name. They were calling me home. The darkness around me deepened as the figure's hand tightened on my arm, its touch colder than anything I had ever felt. It wasn't just the chill that made my skin crawl, but the way its fingers seemed to sink into my flesh, as though they were rooting themselves inside me. The whispers grew louder, overwhelming my thoughts, drowning out everything else. Stay with us, Ethan. You belong here. The voice was no longer just a whisper, it was a command, a certainty that seeped into my very bones. I tried to pull away, but the figure's grip was unyielding, like the earth itself had come alive to claim me. The trees around us began to shake, their branches twisting and writhing as though they were alive, stretching toward me, eager to pull me into the darkness. The world around me became distorted. The forest, once familiar, now felt alien and hostile. The ground beneath my feet seemed to shift, as if the very earth was turning to mud, sucking at my feet, pulling me deeper into the forest's grip. I looked around, trying to make sense of my surroundings, but everything seemed to blur. The trees loomed over me like ancient sentinels, their bark twisted and gnarled. The air was thick, almost suffocating, and the shadows clung to the trunks of the trees like dark tendrils, crawling toward me as if they were alive. Ethan, the voice came again, this time from all around me. You cannot leave. You are part of the forest now. I felt the panic rise in my chest, the cold pressure of fear squeezing the air from my lungs. My mind raced as I struggled to understand what was happening, to make sense of this nightmare. But the more I thought, the more I realized that there was no escape. No way out. The figure stepped closer, its presence looming over me like a shadow, its glowing eyes the only thing visible in the suffocating dark. It tilted its head slightly, as though studying me, and I could feel its gaze seeping into my very soul. Don't be afraid, Ethan. We have waited for you. The voice was calm, almost soothing, but there was an undeniable weight to it. A finality that made my heart race. The trees around me groaned, their branches creaking as if they were reaching out, beckoning me to join them. The ground beneath me seemed to shift, the roots rising like serpents, twisting and writhing, ready to drag me down into the earth. I tried to scream, but no sound came out. My throat was dry, my body frozen in place, paralyzed by the overwhelming force of the forest's will. The whispers were deafening now, a cacophony of voices, each one calling my name, urging me to stay. Ethan, they whispered again, their voices like the rustling of leaves, like the wind howling through the trees. You are one of us now. Forever. I felt the pull again, stronger this time, like a magnetic force drawing me toward the center of the forest, to the heart of whatever power resided here. I didn't want to go. I didn't want to stay. But my legs moved on their own, my body compelled by some unseen force. The figure's glowing eyes never left me, its presence a constant pressure, suffocating and oppressive. It reached out again, its long fingers brushing my cheek, cold as ice, sending a jolt of fear through my entire body. You are here to stay, Ethan. We're your family now. The forest will never let you leave. I struggled, trying to break free, but my body refused to obey. The whispers surrounded me, louder now, like a storm swirling in my ears. I tried to fight it, to scream, but it was as though the very air had thickened, choking me, making every breath a struggle. I stumbled forward, my feet heavy, unwilling to move, but I couldn't stop myself. The trees seemed to bend toward me, their branches reaching like arms, ready to pull me into their depths. The figure moved closer, its shadow consuming everything around me. Its eyes were all I could see now, glowing with an unnatural light, like the light of something ancient, something older than the forest itself. And then, just as I thought I could bear no more, the whispers stopped. The forest fell silent. The air was still. The trees no longer groaned or creaked. Everything was quiet, as though the world had stopped turning. For a moment, I thought I had escaped, that somehow I had broken free. But when I looked around, I realized something terrible. The forest wasn't just still. It was watching me. I could feel the eyes of the trees on me, the weight of their gaze pressing down, suffocating me. They were waiting for something, waiting for me to accept my fate. I knew then that I had made a terrible mistake. There was no escape from this place, no way out. The forest had claimed me, and I was never going to leave. And as the figure stepped closer, its fingers reaching for me again, I understood the truth. There was no escaping the trees. They had already won. I could feel the weight of the forest pressing in on me, its silence more deafening than any noise. The trees, their massive trunks stretching toward the dark sky, seemed to sway in rhythm as if they were breathing, alive with some ancient power. Their branches, knotted and twisted, reached toward me like fingers, each movement deliberate, as though they were waiting for my next move. My heart raced in my chest, and the air felt thick, heavy, as if the trees themselves were suffocating me. Every step I took felt like I was sinking deeper, the ground beneath my feet softening with each movement. I tried to break free, but no matter how much I struggled, the forest seemed to hold me tighter. I looked back, hoping for some sign of escape, but all I saw was the same darkness, an endless stretch of trees that had become more oppressive with every passing moment. The path I had walked down had disappeared, swallowed whole by the deep shadows. I was trapped. "You cannot leave," the voice whispered again, this time closer, more intimate. "You belong to us now, Ethan. Forever." I turned, my breath catching in my throat. The figure was standing just behind me, its dark eyes glowing in the pitch black, its presence sending a chill through my entire body. It seemed to loom over me, towering like a ghost from some forgotten era, its face hidden in shadow, its breath cold against my skin. I stumbled backward, my hands reaching for anything, but the trees around me seemed to close in, their limbs stretching out to catch me. The whispers had returned, rising in volume, filling my ears with their terrible song. "Stay. Stay with us." My mind screamed for escape, but my body felt paralyzed, unable to move, as if the very ground beneath me had rooted me in place. I struggled, my legs trembling, but I couldn't break free. It was as if the forest had taken control of me, its will stronger than anything I had ever known. "We will not let you go," the figure whispered, its voice now more commanding, like an order I couldn't refuse. "You are ours, Ethan. You will be one with the forest." I felt a strange pull within me, a tugging at the very core of my being, as though the forest itself was reaching inside me, trying to claim me completely. The whispers grew louder, more frantic, and the air seemed to grow colder with each passing second. I tried to call out, to scream, but my voice was lost, swallowed by the dense fog of the trees. I could feel the warmth of the light fading, replaced by an unnatural chill that seeped into my bones, draining me of all strength. The figure moved closer, its form shifting in and out of the shadows, becoming something more intangible, a presence that I couldn't fully understand. Its hand reached out again, fingers long and claw-like, and for a moment, I thought it would touch me. But then, in a sudden flash, the world around me shifted. The trees groaned, their branches creaking as if the forest itself was waking up, shifting, moving with a purpose. The ground beneath me trembled, and I could feel the earth moving, the roots beneath me stirring, as if they were alive, pushing me toward the center of the forest. I looked down at my feet, and I saw them, roots, thick and twisting, rising from the ground like serpents, wrapping around my ankles, pulling me deeper into the earth. I tried to break free, but the roots were stronger than anything I had ever felt. They wrapped tighter around me, their cold grip dragging me down. I gasped for air, my chest tightening as the roots began to pull me underground. The trees around me seemed to grow taller, their branches reaching farther, their shadows closing in, enveloping me. The whispers rose to a deafening crescendo, surrounding me, filling my mind with their terrifying demands. You cannot leave, Ethan. You will stay with us. Forever. The ground shifted beneath me, pulling me deeper, and I could feel the weight of the earth pressing down on me. My body was no longer my own. It felt as though the forest had taken control, claiming me piece by piece, until there would be nothing left. I fought with everything I had, but the darkness was overwhelming. The forest was all around me, suffocating me, trapping me. I could hear my heart pounding in my chest, feel the cold grip of the roots tightening, and I knew, deep down, that there was no way out. Then, just as I thought I would be lost forever, something changed. The whispering stopped. The pressure around me lessened. I looked up, my breath ragged, and saw the figure standing before me, its glowing eyes fixed on me with an intensity that made my skin crawl. It didn't speak, but the message was clear. It had won. The trees were silent now, their presence no longer oppressive but serene, as though they had been waiting for this moment. I felt the roots begin to loosen their grip, pulling away from my legs, retreating back into the earth. I stumbled forward, my body weak and trembling, as the figure stepped back into the shadows. Go, it whispered, but there was no warmth in its voice, no invitation. It was an order. I didn't hesitate. I ran. The forest, for all its mystery and danger, was still familiar. I knew the path now. I could see the trees receding, the shadows pulling back, as if the forest itself was allowing me to leave. I didn't look back. But I knew, deep down, that the forest would always be there, waiting. It would always be watching, listening for my return. And as I ran, the final whisper echoed in my mind, chilling me to my core. You are never truly free, Ethan. The trees will always call to you. And with that, I understood the truth. The forest never lets go. I barely slept that night. My mind raced, my body shaking from the memory of the forest. I could still hear the whispers, faint but persistent, like a shadow lingering just beyond my reach. No matter how much I tried to block them out, they crept in, curling around my thoughts, reminding me of what had happened. The daylight offered little comfort. I went through the motions of my daily routine, but everything felt off. My once familiar surroundings seemed foreign now, like the world itself was a mask, hiding something beneath, something that wanted me back. The air tasted different, even the light felt strange, colder and harsher. I tried to tell myself it was just fear, just the lingering effects of what I'd experienced in the forest. But deep down, I knew something had changed. The forest had marked me, branded me with its presence, and it wasn't finished with me. That night, the whispers returned. I lay in bed, trying to close my eyes and will myself to sleep. But the sound, the soft, hissing murmurs, grew louder. I could hear it clearly now, so real, so close, like it was in the room with me. My breath quickened, my pulse pounding in my ears, but I couldn't move. Ethan, come back. The voice was unmistakable now. It wasn't just the wind. It wasn't just a trick of the mind. The trees were calling to me again, their voices swirling around me like a storm, desperate, pleading. They were waiting for me, as they always had. I pulled the covers over my head, trying to drown out the sound, but it only grew louder, more insistent. I squeezed my eyes shut, praying for it to stop, but it wouldn't. The whispers seeped into every corner of the room, filling the space, filling my head. You belong with us, Ethan. The words were like a curse, echoing inside me, sinking deep into my soul. I didn't want to go back. I couldn't go back. I had left, escaped, hadn't I? I had run, and I had survived. But the forest's call, it wouldn't stop. I finally opened my eyes, and as I did, the shadows around me seemed to twist, elongating, reaching out like the branches of the trees. The darkness seemed to be alive, pulling at me, pulling me back into its grip. The air in the room grew cold, colder than it should have been. My breath misted in front of me, and I felt an overwhelming pressure, as if the walls were closing in. I scrambled to sit up, my heart racing, panic flooding my chest. I looked around, but there was nothing, no sign of any physical danger. The room was empty, still, save for the shadows that danced on the walls. But I knew something was coming. The door creaked open, and I froze, my eyes wide in terror. I didn't move, not even to breathe. And then I saw it. Standing in the doorway, just at the edge of the dark, was a figure. It was the same figure from the forest, its face hidden, its eyes glowing with that same eerie light. It didn't speak. It didn't need to. The air itself crackled with the unspoken words between us. It's time to come home, Ethan, the voice whispered, the same voice that had echoed in my mind. My body shook uncontrollably, but I couldn't move. I couldn't run. The figure was there, in the doorway, and the darkness was all around me, swallowing everything. Suddenly, the floor beneath me groaned, and the roots began to rise again, twisting from the floorboards, winding their way up my legs. I could feel them, their cold, unforgiving grip, pulling me toward the door, pulling me toward the forest. I screamed, struggling against the roots, but they were too strong, tightening with every movement, dragging me closer to the figure. You cannot escape, the figure said, its voice no longer a whisper but a command. You will return to the forest. You will stay with us, forever. Tears streamed down my face, but I couldn't stop. The roots were pulling me, the shadows were closing in, and the forest's whispers were so loud, so overwhelming, that I couldn't hear my own thoughts. I wanted to scream. I wanted to fight. But the darkness was too strong. The pull was too much. I was being taken. Again. And I knew, deep in my heart, that there would be no escape this time. The trees had claimed me, and now they would never let go. Have you ever heard a song that you couldn't forget, but not because you remembered it? I never thought something like that could happen, something that would play out in front of me, yet feel like it existed in another world. But that's what happened. It started with a sound. A faint, distant melody drifting from my old piano. It was the kind of sound you might mistake for the wind, or maybe a trick of the light. But no, it was coming from the piano. The piano had been gathering dust in the corner of my living room for years. I'd inherited it from my grandmother, and after a few months of attempts, I'd given up on playing. It seemed like nothing more than an ancient piece of furniture now, a relic of the past, something that didn't belong to me. The keys were chipped, the strings were rusty, and the wood was warped. But that melody, it was as clear as if someone had just started playing, the notes lingering in the air. At first, I thought I was imagining it, my mind playing tricks on me. But when I walked over to the piano, the sound didn't stop. The air felt colder, thicker. And I swear, I saw the keys move slightly as if touched by invisible fingers. I froze. My heart pounded in my chest, and for a moment, I considered leaving the room. But the sound, it was so strange, so familiar, I had to know what it was. I sat down at the piano, hesitant, almost afraid to touch it. The melody seemed to be calling me, pulling me in. It was a song I didn't recognize, yet it felt like I had heard it 1,000 times before. The more I listened, the more it seemed like it was pulling me towards something. Something beyond the walls of my house, beyond the limits of reality. Then, without even thinking, I placed my fingers on the keys. My heart raced as I pressed down. The first note echoed through the room, and I felt a sudden shift in the air. It was subtle, but undeniable. Something changed. The room seemed to darken, and the shadows on the walls stretched longer. The melody, it wasn't just a song anymore. It was something else. Something that made my skin crawl. I kept playing. I couldn't stop. Each note seemed to open a door that led deeper into something I couldn't understand. The music filled my ears, wrapping around me, drowning out everything else. The world outside the house seemed to blur, as though it was no longer there. I didn't realize at first, but as I continued to play, the walls of the room began to fade, the furniture distorting, twisting into shapes that didn't belong. The window panes, once clear, now reflected someone standing just outside. I could feel them watching me. I could feel their presence, cold and heavy, like something was waiting for me to stop. I was so lost in the music, in the strange power it seemed to have, that I almost didn't notice the change. But there, in the corner of the room, something moved. It was a figure, too dark to see clearly, but I could feel its eyes on me, feel its breath as if it was right behind me. My fingers stumbled on the keys, and the melody faltered, becoming something darker, more distorted. The room began to feel smaller, suffocating. The air grew thick, almost impossible to breathe. And then, there was a voice. It was soft at first, a whisper that seemed to rise from the very walls themselves. "You shouldn't have played it." I stopped. My hands jerked away from the keys. The melody ceased immediately, but the voice didn't go away. It lingered in the air, swirling around me. My breath caught in my throat. I stood up, suddenly feeling dizzy. The room, it wasn't right. Everything was wrong. The shadows were no longer just shadows. They had shape, they had movement. The walls seemed to close in around me, pressing in until the space felt too small, too confined. I backed away from the piano, but the room wouldn't let me go. The air, once stale, was now filled with something else, something alive. Something that had been waiting. "You've opened the door," the voice whispered again, colder this time. I ran for the door, but as my hand touched the doorknob, the sound of the melody returned. This time, louder, more intense. The room around me twisted violently, the shadows reaching for me, pulling at my legs, trying to hold me back. I turned the knob and flung the door open. The world outside looked different. The street outside my window was no longer there. Instead, there was a dark, endless forest, stretching into a sky that wasn't the sky I knew. The trees swayed, their branches twisting as if they were alive, and I could hear them whispering, "Stay with us." I ran. I didn't know how I ended up outside. I didn't know how the world around me had changed so quickly, but I knew one thing for sure: I couldn't go back inside. The trees in front of me weren't like any I'd seen before. They towered over me, their bark twisted into grotesque shapes, their branches long and gnarled like fingers reaching toward the sky. The air was thick, heavy with something I couldn't identify, something that made my heart race and my breath catch in my throat. I turned to look back at the house. The door was still open, but the house itself seemed farther away now. The walls were dark, distant, like they were sinking into the ground. It felt like it wasn't even my house anymore. "Stay with us." The whisper came again, louder this time, clearer. The trees, they were talking to me. I staggered backwards, my legs shaky, my mind spinning. The grass beneath my feet was soft, like it was cushioning each step I took, but it felt wrong, too soft, almost like it was alive. As I took another step, I heard a crack behind me. I spun around, expecting to see something, but the forest was silent again, as if it had never made a sound. My pulse quickened. I didn't know how much longer I could keep running, or what I was even running from. But I couldn't stay. Not in this place. Not with that voice, those whispers. Not with the feeling that the trees, the shadows, the very air itself was watching me. The wind shifted suddenly, blowing through the branches above me, sending a chill down my spine. I paused for a moment, trying to steady myself. The silence felt heavy, pressing in on me, making it hard to breathe. I could hear my heart beating in my ears, each thought a reminder of how alone I was in this place. That's why I saw it. At the edge of the clearing, between two twisted trees, there was a figure standing still. It was hard to make out, but it was tall and thin, dressed in a dark, tattered cloak that hung from its shoulders like a shadow itself. Its face was hidden, obscured by the hood, but I could feel its gaze, cold and unyielding. My breath caught in my throat. I tried to back away, but my legs felt rooted to the spot. The figure didn't move, but its presence was enough to make the air feel colder, more suffocating. "You shouldn't have played it." The voice, again, but now it was coming from the figure. It was deep, distorted, like it wasn't human. My body froze as I realized that the figure wasn't alone. From the darkness behind it, shapes began to emerge, more figures, cloaked in the same tattered robes. They moved slowly, almost imperceptibly, as if they were part of the forest itself. I wanted to scream, to run, but my voice caught in my throat, strangled by the fear that gripped me. The shadows moved closer, their presence suffocating, and I knew they were not just shadows, they were something else, something ancient. One of the figures stepped forward, its movements slow but deliberate. It raised its hand, and for a brief moment, I thought it was reaching out to me. But instead, it pointed directly at me. "You open the door," it said, its voice sending a shiver through me. I tried to back away again, but my feet felt heavy, like the earth itself was pulling me in. The trees, the shadows, the figures, they were all closing in on me. I was surrounded, trapped. I forced myself to take a step back, then another. My legs shook beneath me, but I kept moving, slowly, desperately, as if the distance between me and the figures might give me a chance to escape. But the whispers, they were growing louder. I could hear them now, coming from all directions. The trees, the wind, the figures, they were all speaking in unison. "Stay with us, forever." I ran. I didn't know where I was going or how long I could keep this up, but I had to get away. My mind raced, but there was no way out. The forest seemed endless, stretching on forever, and the trees kept shifting, closing in on me with every step. The whispers didn't stop. They followed me, their voices growing stronger with each passing second, as if they were pulling me deeper into the heart of the forest. You can never leave. You belong here now. I stumbled over a root, falling to the ground, but I didn't stop. I scrambled to my feet, heart pounding in my chest, eyes scanning the trees for any sign of escape. But it was hopeless. I could feel it, something pulling me in, something much more powerful than my own will. The music. The melody I hadn't played. It had opened the door. It had let them in. And now, I wasn't just running from the forest. I was running from something that had already claimed me. Something that wouldn't let me go. I was beginning to understand. I was never meant to leave. The forest was closing in, and I couldn't breathe. The air was thick with an oppressive weight, suffocating every ounce of my strength. I could still hear the whispers, "Stay with us, forever," but now they were louder, more frantic, as if the trees themselves were urging me to fall deeper into their grasp. I tried to run, my legs burning from the effort, but the ground beneath me felt like it was shifting, swallowing my steps. The path ahead seemed to twist and warp, leading me in circles, making it impossible to break free. No matter how fast I ran, I never seemed to get any farther from the figures in the distance. They were still out there, lurking in the shadows, watching me. I stumbled again, my breath coming in ragged gasps as I collapsed onto the soft, damp earth. I tried to push myself up, but my arms felt too weak, my body too tired. The weight of the whispers, of the forest itself, was pressing down on me, pulling me deeper into the dark embrace of the trees. "You cannot escape," the voice echoed in my mind, deep and resonant, vibrating in my chest. It wasn't just the figures anymore. The forest had a voice now, and it was speaking directly to me. I pressed my hands to my ears, but it didn't help. The words were inside me, filling my head with an unbearable noise, drowning out all thoughts except one: you belong to the forest. My eyes darted around in a panic. Everything looked the same: twisted branches, tangled roots, and shadows that seemed to stretch and bend unnaturally. There was no escape. I had to find a way to stop it. To stop the music. The piano. The damn piano. I remembered it. I remembered the haunting melody that had played on its own, filling the air with its eerie tune. That was what had started all of this. The music had opened the door. The melody I hadn't played had called them. But what if I played it? What if I gave in and played it all the way through? I looked up, my eyes scanning the dense forest, searching for anything familiar. I had no idea where I was, but I knew I couldn't stay here. I couldn't let the forest claim me. That's why I saw it. A faint glow in the distance. At first, I thought it was just another illusion, a trick of the dark, but it didn't fade. It stayed steady, like a beacon in the chaos. I pushed myself to my feet, my body protesting, but I couldn't stop. The light was there. It was my only chance. I had to get to it. With every step I took, the whispering grew louder. "You belong to us." The words were no longer a soft murmur, but a cacophony, ringing in my ears, vibrating through my very bones. The forest itself was alive with the sound of its hunger, its need to claim me. I stumbled forward, my vision blurring, the glow growing brighter with each agonizing step. The trees around me seemed to close in tighter, but I pushed forward, driven by the desperate need to escape the suffocating pull of the forest. The light was closer now, and I could make out the shape of a small clearing ahead. At its center stood the piano. It was glowing, too. A soft, eerie light emanated from it, illuminating the darkness around it. The piano's keys were shimmering, and I could hear the faintest sound, like the echo of a melody. The same melody. It was the song. The one I hadn't played. I didn't want to do it. I didn't want to play. But I knew what would happen if I didn't. The forest would consume me. The whispers would never stop. And the figures would be waiting for me, forever. I stepped forward, my hands shaking as I reached for the keys. The music seemed to call to me, urging me to play. I took a deep breath, my heart pounding in my chest, and pressed the first key. The sound was immediate, soft, haunting, and familiar. It was like the piano had been waiting for me, just as the forest had. I couldn't stop now. The music filled the clearing, a dark, beautiful melody that resonated deep within me. It felt like it was coming from everywhere, filling the air, filling my mind. With each note I played, the shadows around me seemed to stretch longer, darker. The figures were moving closer, their cloaked forms drifting silently through the trees. I could hear their whispers growing louder, clearer. You are ours now. The piano's voice joined theirs, the melody becoming more insistent, more urgent. It wasn't just a song anymore, it was a command. I had to keep playing. I had to finish it. But every time my fingers touched the keys, I felt like I was giving more of myself away. The trees were feeding on me, the forest consuming me, piece by piece. The clearing around me had disappeared. There was no more sky, no more earth beneath my feet. It was just the piano and me, floating in a sea of dark shadows. The melody was a part of me now, wrapping around my soul, pulling me deeper into its world. I had to stop. But I couldn't. You opened the door, the figures whispered. Now you will stay. I played the last note, and in that instant, the world around me collapsed. And then, silence. I woke up on the floor of my living room. The familiar surroundings felt alien, as if I was seeing them for the first time. My fingers were stiff, still aching from the piano keys, but the space around me was calm, almost too calm. The air was still, and yet there was a sense of rawness that lingered, like something had shifted, something I couldn't place. I sat up slowly, glancing around. The piano was silent now, just a simple piece of furniture in the corner, untouched. There were no whispers, no figures lurking in the shadows. The world seemed as it should be. But I knew better. I knew something had changed. The melody was still in my head, haunting me. Every note, every chord I had played, was reverberating in my skull, a reminder of what I had done, of what I had unleashed. I could still hear the trees, still feel their pull. It was as if I had never truly left the forest, as if the line between the two worlds had blurred. I stood, my legs unsteady, and walked toward the window. The sky was the same, gray, overcast, but there was something different in the air. A heaviness that clung to the atmosphere, something oppressive that made the air feel thick and suffocating. The world outside seemed just as it had before, but I could feel it, a subtle change, like the ground beneath me had shifted. Then, I saw it. In the distance, through the trees, I saw the outline of something moving. It was far away, just a shadow, but it was there. I tried to convince myself it was nothing, just the wind, just my mind playing tricks. but I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone, that I was being watched. I stepped back from the window, heart racing. The melody in my head grew louder, more insistent, each note like a pulse in my veins. I tried to block it out, to focus on the present, but it was impossible. I could feel the forest calling me again, tugging at the edges of my consciousness. It wasn't done with me. It had only just begun. I ran to the piano, desperate to stop it, to escape whatever was happening. My hands trembled as they hovered over the keys, but I couldn't bring myself to play. Not again. Not after what had happened. I had opened the door, and now there was no closing it. Then, a voice, low and distant, whispered through the room. "You cannot escape." It was the same voice from the forest. The one that had whispered my name, the one that had demanded I stay. It was here, in my home, in the very air I breathed. The room felt smaller, closing in around me, as if the walls themselves were pressing in. The melody echoed louder, now rising like a storm. I grabbed my jacket, shaking, and bolted for the door. I had to get out, had to leave, but where could I go? The forest wasn't just a place. It was a force, an entity, and it was following me. I stepped outside, the chill air biting at my skin. The world seemed to have shifted again. The trees were closer than they should have been, their twisted branches reaching toward me, almost as if they were alive. I could feel them watching, waiting, and in the distance, the figures moved again, barely visible in the haze. They were closer now, so much closer. "You belong to us," the voice echoed, not in my ears, but inside my head, vibrating through my thoughts. "You cannot escape. You will never escape." I turned and ran, my feet pounding the ground as I fled from the forest that had once seemed so far away. But no matter how fast I ran, no matter how far I went, the trees followed. Their whispers, their calls, they were everywhere. I was trapped. The world around me twisted, warped as the melody grew louder. My breath was ragged, my chest tight as I stumbled through the forest. The trees seemed to close in, their branches clawing at my skin, their shadows darkening the path ahead. I couldn't escape. It was like being pulled into a nightmare, one where I was both the prisoner and the prey. And then, just as I thought I couldn't take it anymore, the ground beneath me gave way. I fell, tumbling into darkness. When I awoke, I was lying on the damp, cold ground. My body ached, my limbs heavy and sore, but the forest was silent. The oppressive weight had lifted. For a moment, I thought maybe it was over. Maybe the nightmare had finally ended. But when I opened my eyes, I saw it. The piano. It was standing in front of me, out of place, as though it had always been here, as though it had never left. And the keys, they were glowing. I could feel it, deep in my chest, the melody pulling at me once again. The music was calling. I didn't move. I couldn't. My body felt frozen, caught in the magnetic pull of the piano, the keys beckoning to me like a siren song. The melody was stronger now, reverberating through the ground beneath me, through the air around me, seeping into every corner of my mind. I had to get away. But how? Every instinct screamed for me to run, yet the sound held me captive. My hands twitched, unwillingly, toward the piano, as if some invisible force was guiding them. The longer I stared at it, the more I felt myself being consumed by the sound, the more I felt it seeping into my very bones, twisting my thoughts, my fears. I thought back to everything that had happened since I first heard the music, the strange way the world around me had shifted. The whispers, the shadows, the figures in the trees. It was all connected to this damn melody. This cursed song. I had played it once, and now it was playing me. The ground trembled beneath me as I stood, my legs unsteady, each step toward the piano a struggle. The shadows grew longer, darker, as if the trees themselves were reaching out, hungry. I felt the air grow colder, the breeze turning into a gust of wind, pushing me forward, urging me to play. I hesitated, my fingers inches from the keys. Every part of me screamed to stop, to never touch them again. But the song was louder now, the pressure in my chest unbearable. The trees around me rustled, their whispers growing into frantic voices. They were chanting my name over and over, urging me to play, to join them. "You cannot escape," they whispered. "We are part of you." I took a deep breath and slammed my hands onto the keys. The world around me shattered. The sound that erupted from the piano was unlike anything I had ever heard. It was a wave, crashing against me, drowning me in its fury. The trees screamed, their branches twisting and warping, their trunks splitting apart. The sky darkened, swirling into a vortex of black and gray, and the ground beneath me cracked open. I was falling into the music, into the void it had created. And then, just as suddenly, everything stopped. I lay on the cold, hard ground, gasping for breath. The forest was silent again. The trees stood still, their shadows stretching long into the distance. The world was still. But it wasn't the same. The air was thick with an unnatural stillness, and I felt different. Changed. I pushed myself to my feet, my legs shaking, my mind racing. The piano was gone, but I could still hear the melody echoing in my head like a distant hum. The trees were watching me again, their branches swaying gently in the breeze, but there was something in their silence that was worse than any scream. I turned to leave, to escape, but I couldn't. Something in the distance caught my eye. A figure. It was standing at the edge of the trees, watching me. I couldn't make out its features, but I felt its gaze, cold and knowing. I froze, my heart pounding in my chest. I wanted to scream, to run, but my body wouldn't obey. The melody grew louder, and the trees began to move, closing in around me. And then the figure stepped forward. It was me. But it wasn't. The figure that approached was like a twisted reflection of myself, the same but wrong in every way. It was hollow, its eyes dark and empty, its movements jerky, like a puppet on strings. It opened its mouth, and the song spilled out, my song, my melody. But it wasn't the same anymore. It was distorted, broken, a haunting mockery of what it had once been. "You cannot escape," it whispered in my voice. "You are already part of it." I tried to move, to run, but the ground held me in place, roots twisting around my legs, pulling me down into the earth. The figure continued to move closer, the song growing louder, more intense. And I realized, too late, that I had already played my part. I had crossed the line. I had opened the door, and now there was no closing it. The forest, the melody, the shadows, they were all part of me. And I would never be free. The figure reached out, its hand cold and empty, and I could feel it take hold of me, pulling me into the darkness. And the melody played on. It started with a simple question, something I had been asking myself for days. How could this be possible? How could these photographs exist? I had been cleaning the attic, sifting through boxes of old belongings that belonged to my late uncle. His name was Thomas, and he had been a quiet man, kept to himself mostly, a lover of photography and obscure things. It was no surprise when I found the camera, dusty and old, buried in the back of a forgotten chest. I had seen it before, a familiar relic of my childhood, but I had never paid it much attention. Inside the camera was a roll of film. It was strange, no label, just a faint imprint of something written in fading ink on the side of the canister. The film looked decades old, but I didn't hesitate to take it to a local lab to get developed. I knew it would be an interesting relic from the past. But when I picked up the photographs the next day, something was wrong. The first picture was of a familiar street. It looked like my neighborhood, but I had never taken a photograph from this angle. In the corner of the frame, standing near a tree, was a figure, me. The man in the picture wore my clothes, had my face, but I had no recollection of ever being there. The next photo was even more disturbing. It was taken in an old diner I remembered from my childhood, the one I used to visit with my parents. The picture showed the exterior, but I was standing by the door, watching through the window. My own face was blurred in the photograph, like someone had smudged it. I had a strange feeling, like I was looking at something I shouldn't be. It was as if the photographs weren't from the past at all, but from some alternate reality or a parallel world. My pulse quickened as I flipped through the rest of the images. There were more places I didn't recognize, dark alleys, abandoned buildings, and a forest I was sure I had never seen before. But in every single shot, my figure was present, always in the corner of the frame, always looking as though it was watching. A deep chill ran through me. I had to find out more. That night, I decided to visit one of the places from the photographs. The diner. It was closed, but the familiar neon lights hummed faintly in the distance. I stood there for a moment, feeling the wind against my skin, trying to shake the unease that was building inside of me. Was I supposed to be here? Was I meant to see this? I stepped inside, the door creaking slightly as it opened. The air was heavy, stale, as if time had stopped. The diner was as I remembered it, but something was off. The booths were empty, the tables frozen in time. And then I heard it, a soft, unsettling creak of the floorboard behind me. I spun around, my breath catching in my throat. Nothing. But something felt wrong. There was an invisible presence, a weight in the air that pressed in on me. The walls seemed to close in, the flickering lights above me casting odd shadows. I felt my legs go weak, and I knew I had to leave. Fast. I turned to the door and froze. There, standing in the doorway, was a figure just like the one in the photograph. It was me. But it wasn't. The man in the doorway had my face, but his eyes were different, dark, hollow, void of any recognition. He was not just a reflection of me, but something else, something twisted. His mouth opened, but no sound came out, just a hollow, eerie silence. My heart raced, and before I could react, the lights above flickered, and the room went pitch dark. A cold gust of wind swept through the diner, and the man in the doorway was gone. I stood there, shaking, my hands trembling as I fumbled for the door handle. But just before I reached it, the lights flickered back on. And there, in the corner of the room, was the figure again, this time much closer. Its face was no longer just like mine, but twisted into something grotesque. It stepped forward, slow and deliberate, and I felt the air thicken around me. The silence was deafening, and the world around me seemed to distort, like I was being pulled into another dimension. I had to get out. I ran toward the door, my heart pounding in my chest. As I reached the exit, I looked back once more. the figure was gone. The diner was empty again. But the photograph I had seen was still in my mind, the me in the corner, always there, always watching. I didn't know what it meant, but I had the strange, overwhelming feeling that I was no longer in control of the world around me. The photographs were not just memories of places I had been, but signs of something darker, something pulling me closer to its grasp. And I knew it wasn't over. The figure in the pictures, in the diner, in the shadows, it was not me, but something I had become. And it was waiting. I stumbled out of the diner, my feet barely touching the ground as I ran. The cold night air slapped my face, but I didn't feel it. My mind raced, thoughts spiraling out of control. What had just happened? Was I losing my grip on reality? Or had I crossed into some other, twisted version of the world I knew? I didn't dare look behind me as I made my way down the street, the eerie silence of the diner lingering in my thoughts like a haunting echo. I couldn't shake the image of the figure, the version of me, but wrong, so wrong. I could still feel its eyes on me, empty and hollow, as if it were searching for something only I could give. I didn't go home. I couldn't bear the thought of developing more of those photographs, each one pulling me deeper into whatever nightmare this was. Instead, I drove aimlessly, my hands gripping the wood tightly, knuckles white with tension. I stopped in the middle of nowhere, a patch of land I vaguely recognized from one of the photographs. The trees, the overgrown grass, they were all here. I had never been here before, but this place, this exact spot, was captured on the film. It was too precise to be a coincidence. I could feel it now, the weight of something watching me, just like in the diner. Something was drawing me in. I stepped out of the car, the crunch of gravel under my boots breaking the oppressive silence. The night was still, far too still. The air was heavy, thick with a tension I couldn't place, like the world was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. I turned and looked around, my eyes scanning the darkness. I couldn't explain it, but the hairs on the back of my neck stood up. There was something else here, something not quite visible, but undeniably present. The trees stood like sentinels, their branches twisting in unnatural ways, their shadows too deep, too purposeful. And then I heard it. A soft, rhythmic tapping, like the sound of fingers drumming against a wooden surface. My heart skipped a beat. It was coming from behind me, from the direction of the trees. Slowly, cautiously, I turned. My eyes widened. There, just beyond the line of trees, was a figure. Not like the one in the diner, not yet. But it was familiar. It was me again. Or at least it looked like me. I couldn't make out its face clearly, but I knew, deep down, that it was the same twisted version that had been following me. The tapping sound continued, growing louder, more deliberate. It was as if the figure was beckoning me, coaxing me closer. My mind screamed for me to run, to turn around and get in the car, to escape. But I couldn't. I was rooted to the spot, drawn to it like a moth to a flame. My legs moved without my consent, carrying me closer, against my will, toward the thing that was not quite me. As I took another step, the air shifted. It was colder now, sharper, the wind biting at my skin as if it were alive, aware of my every move. The tapping continued, rhythmic and hypnotic, until I was close enough to see the figure's face, or what was left of it. It wasn't a face at all, not anymore. It was a blur of my features, distorted, as if the very essence of who I was had been warped into something monstrous. The figure's mouth stretched into a grin, wide and unnatural. Its eyes were hollow, Endless black pits, staring straight through me, as though it could see the very core of my being. "Come closer," it whispered, its voice a hollow echo of my own. "It's your turn now. Your place in the picture." The words sent a jolt of terror through me, but my feet kept moving. I was powerless to stop them. My heart raced, every fiber of my being screaming to break free, to flee. But I couldn't. The figure reached out, its hands long and clawed, fingers twitching like it was eager to touch me, to pull me into the dark, into the frame of the photograph where I had never belonged. Suddenly, everything froze. The wind stopped, the trees stood motionless. The figure, still grinning, did not move. It was as if time itself had paused, and I was caught in the stillness, trapped between two worlds. The world of the photographs, and the world of the living. I stared at the figure, my breath caught in my throat. It wasn't just a shadow of me, it was me, a version of me that had slipped through the cracks of time and reality, a version that had been there all along, hidden in the edges of the photographs. It wasn't waiting for me to find it, it had been waiting for me to become it. And I realized, with a sinking dread, that it had already begun. The line between the world I knew and the world in the photographs was thinning, fraying at the edges. I had crossed that line, and now there was no turning back. I reached out instinctively, my hand trembling, as if to touch the figure, to understand what it wanted. But as my fingers brushed against its skin, I felt something colder than the air around me. It was as if I were touching the very fabric of the universe itself, a part of something that was neither alive nor dead. And then, with a final, echoing whisper, the figure spoke again, "You're in the frame now." I recoiled in terror, but it was too late. The world around me began to blur, twisting, distorting as though reality itself was breaking apart. I was being pulled into it, the photograph, the world beyond the frame. And as the darkness closed in, I realized I was no longer the observer. I had become part of the picture. And the picture had no end. Hope your dreams are filled with fear. Good night.